Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The night shift along the Waianae coast was supposed to be routine. Deputy Keahi Kealoha had worked this stretch of Oahu's western shore for nearly 4 years, and he knew every pothole, every blind curve, and every spot where locals like to park after dark to watch the waves crash against the lava rock. The coast road hugged the shoreline so tightly that on stormy nights, saltwater spray would coat his windshield even with the windows rolled up. Tonight wasn't stormy yet, but the Weather Service had been tracking a system moving in from the northeast, promising heavy swells and rain by midnight. The kind of weather that made commercial fishermen tie down their boats early and recreational sailors think twice about being anywhere near the water. Keahi had just finished his second thermos of coffee when the radio crackled to life. It was Dispatcher Nalani Maho, her voice calm but carrying that subtle edge that veteran dispatchers developed when something felt off. She reported a call from a local fisherman who claimed he'd seen unusual activity near Kehe Point, specifically mentioning multiple vehicles with no headlights moving along the beach access road around 11:15. The fisherman hadn't wanted to give his name, which wasn't uncommon in this area where people minded their own business and preferred not to get involved in police matters. But the detail about the headlights being off caught Keahi's attention. Nobody drove that road in the dark without lights unless they had a reason to avoid being seen. Keahi acknowledged the call and turned his patrol vehicle south toward Kahe Point. The beach access road wasn't much more than a gravel track that branched off the main highway, winding down through scrub brush and kaiawe trees before opening onto a narrow strip of rocky beach. During the day, it was occasionally used by fishermen and families looking for a quieter spot away from the tourist beaches further up the coast. At night, it was usually deserted except for the occasional teenager looking for privacy or someone sleeping rough in their vehicle. The road wasn't posted as restricted, but it wasn't maintained either, and most people avoided it after dark because of how rough and isolated it was. As he approached the turnoff, Keahi killed his own headlights and slowed to a crawl. The access road descended at a steep angle, forcing him to ride his brakes as loose gravel crunched under his tires. The vegetation on either side was thick enough that his vehicle was effectively hidden from the beach until the final 50 yards, which gave him a tactical advantage if someone was down there doing something they shouldn't be. He could already smell the salt air mixing with the earthy scent of wet volcanic soil, and somewhere in the darkness, he heard the rhythmic percussion of waves hitting the shore. The moon was only a thin crescent tonight, providing almost no ambient light, which meant whoever was down here would need artificial lighting to see what they were doing. When the road finally leveled out and the beach came into view, Keahi immediately spotted what the fisherman had called about. 3 vehicles were parked in a rough semicircle near the waterline, their engines off, but their shapes clearly visible against the lighter tone of the wet sand. 2 pickup trucks and what looked like a commercial van, all of them facing the water. No headlights, no interior lights, but Keahi could see the faint glow of flashlights or phones moving around near the vehicles. He counted at least 5 distinct light sources, which meant at least 5 people, possibly more. His instinct told him this wasn't a group of friends having a late-night bonfire. The positioning of the vehicles, the darkness, the isolated location, all of it pointed toward something organized and deliberate. Keahi parked his patrol vehicle at an angle that would give him cover behind the engine block if things went sideways, then radioed Dispatcher Nalani Maho with his position and a request for backup. Nalani confirmed she was dispatching Sergeant Pono Kahananui, who was currently working the northern end of the district but could be there in approximately 18 minutes. Keahi acknowledged and added that he was going to observe from his current position until backup arrived. He wasn't about to walk into an unknown situation with multiple subjects at night without knowing what he was dealing with. Department policy was clear on that, and Keahi had enough experience to know that patience often revealed more than confrontation. He shut off his radio's external speaker and switched to his earpiece so any further communications wouldn't carry across the open beach. Then he settled in to watch. The people near the vehicles were moving with purpose, not the relaxed movements of people socializing. They appeared to be unloading something from the back of one of the pickup trucks, passing objects from person to person in a kind of assembly line formation. Keahi couldn't make out what the objects were from this distance, but the way people were handling them suggested they had some weight and required care. Not heavy enough to require 2 people per object, but substantial enough that people weren't just tossing them around casually. After about 3 minutes of watching this activity, Keahi noticed something that changed his assessment of the situation. One of the flashlight beams swung out toward the water, illuminating what appeared to be a small boat pulled up onto the shore. It was maybe 16 or 18 feet long, an aluminum hull design common among local fishermen, with an outboard motor tilted up out of the water. The boat hadn't been there when Keahi first scanned the beach, which meant it had either just arrived in the last few minutes or he'd missed it in the darkness. Either way, the presence of a boat added a marine element to whatever was happening here, and that pushed this beyond a simple trespassing or suspicious activity call. Keahi zoomed in with his personal binoculars, trying to get a better look at what was being transferred between the trucks and the boat. The objects appeared to be rectangular, roughly the size of milk crates, and wrapped in some kind of dark material, possibly plastic sheeting or canvas. He counted at least 8 of them already stacked in the boat, with more still being passed down the line. Nobody was talking that he could hear, which suggested these people were either very disciplined or very nervous about being overheard. The whole operation had the feel of something practiced, like these people had done this before and knew how to do it efficiently. Just as he was about to radio an update to Nalani, one of the figures near the vehicles turned and appeared to look directly toward Keahi's position. He froze, knowing that any movement could give away his location. The figure held the position for several seconds, then turned back and said something to the others that Keahi couldn't make out. Immediately, all the flashlights went dark. The beach was plunged into near total darkness, broken only by the faint phosphorescence of the waves and the barely visible silhouettes of the vehicles against the sand. Keahi's hand moved instinctively to his service weapon, though he didn't draw it. He was still observing, not engaging, but the sudden change in behavior told him these people knew law enforcement might be nearby. For almost a full minute, nothing moved on the beach. Keahi controlled his breathing and stayed perfectly still, watching the dark shapes of the vehicles and trying to detect any movement. His eyes had adjusted enough to the darkness that he could make out general shapes, but details were impossible without light. Then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of an outboard motor being lowered into water, followed by the whine of a starter cord being pulled. Once, twice, 3 times before the engine caught and settled into a rough idle. Someone was preparing to leave by water, and they were doing it without lights, which meant they were either extremely familiar with these waters or desperate enough not to care about the risks. Keahi raised his radio and was about to call for Marine unit support when he heard vehicle engines starting on the beach. All 3 at once, a coordinated movement that suggested someone had given a signal. Headlights blazed to life, momentarily blinding him even at this distance, and the vehicles began moving. But they weren't coming up the access road toward his position. They were driving south along the beach itself, following the narrow strip of hard-packed sand above the tide line. That route would take them nearly half a mile down the coast before they'd need to find another access point to get back up to the highway, but it also meant they'd completely avoid Keahi's position. The boat, with the outboard motor, was already backing away from shore, its engine barely audible over the sound of the waves. Keahi made a split-second decision. The vehicles were escaping by land, and he couldn't pursue all three at once. But the boat was a single target, and it was moving slowly enough that he might be able to track where it was going. He grabbed his spotlight from the passenger seat, stepped out of his patrol vehicle, and trained the beam directly onto the departing boat. The light caught the aluminum hull clearly, revealing two figures aboard and at least 10 of the wrapped rectangular objects stacked in the center. One of the figures turned toward the light, and for a brief instant Keahi saw a face, male, probably in his 30s, with an expression of pure alarm. The boat's engine suddenly roared to full throttle, the bow lifting as it accelerated away from shore. Keahi kept the spotlight trained on it for as long as he could, but within 30 seconds the boat had moved far enough into the darkness and the swells that the beam couldn't reach it anymore. He could still hear the engine for another minute or so, the sound fading as the boat headed northwest, paralleling the coast but staying well offshore. Then even that sound was swallowed by the wind and the waves, and Keahi was left standing alone on the beach with nothing but tire tracks in the sand and his own racing thoughts about what he'd just witnessed. He returned to his patrol vehicle and immediately radioed a full update to dispatcher Nalani Maho. He described the three vehicles, the boat, the wrapped packages, and the direction each had fled. Nalani copied all the information and advised that Sergeant Pono Kahananui was now approximately 8 minutes out. She also patched in Harbor Warden Kapena Kiwe from the Marine Division, who had been monitoring the radio traffic and wanted details about the boat. Keahi provided everything he could remember: the size, the aluminum hull, the outboard motor, the two occupants, and the approximate heading. Kapena acknowledged and stated he would check harbor records and recent marine activity reports for anything that might match, but his tone suggested he wasn't optimistic about finding much without more identifying information. Keahi walked down to where the vehicles had been parked, his flashlight beam sweeping across the disturbed sand. The tire tracks were deep and clear, 3 distinct tread patterns that might be useful if they could match them to specific vehicles later. There were also footprints, multiple sets, different sizes and styles of shoe soles. He photographed everything with his phone's camera, knowing that the incoming tide would erase all of this evidence within a few hours. Near where the boat had been pulled up onto shore, he found something interesting: a small plastic zip tie that appeared to have been cut off of something. It was industrial grade, the thick kind used to secure cargo or bundle materials together, and it was clean enough that it couldn't have been lying here for more than a few hours. He bagged the zip tie as evidence and continued his search of the immediate area. What he didn't find was almost as interesting as what he did find. There were no cigarette butts, no food wrappers, no soda cans or beer bottles. These people had been disciplined about not leaving any casual trash that might carry fingerprints or DNA. That level of operational security suggested this wasn't amateur hour. These were people who understood how law enforcement investigations worked and had taken active steps to minimize evidence. The only reason Keahi had the zip tie was probably because someone had dropped it in the dark and couldn't find it before they had to leave. Headlights appeared at the top of the access road, and a moment later, Sergeant Pono Kahananui's patrol vehicle descended towards the beach. Pono was a 15-year veteran of the department, built like a retired linebacker and carrying himself with the kind of calm authority that came from having seen just about everything this job could throw at him. He parked next to Keahi's vehicle and stepped out, already scanning the scene with a practiced eye. Keahi gave him a quick verbal rundown of everything that had happened, and Pono listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally and taking his own notes on a small pad he always carried. When Keahi finished, Pono walked down to examine the tire tracks and footprints himself. He spent several minutes just looking, occasionally crouching to get a closer view of specific details. Finally, he stood up and turned to Keahi with an expression that suggested he'd reached some conclusions. He stated that, based on the vehicle positioning, the organized nature of the operation and the use of a boat for transport, this had all the hallmarks of a smuggling operation. The question was what they were smuggling. Drugs were the obvious answer, but the size and number of the packages seemed wrong for that. Too bulky, not enough care being taken with individual units. Pono suggested they might be looking at stolen property, possibly electronics or other high-value goods being moved between islands to avoid law enforcement attention. Keahi agreed that made sense, but he raised the question of why anyone would do this kind of transfer at night on an isolated beach instead of just using legitimate shipping. The risk of law enforcement detection, boat accidents, and lost cargo seemed to outweigh any benefit of avoiding normal channels. Pono considered that and offered an alternative theory. Perhaps whatever was being moved couldn't go through normal channels because it would be flagged by customs or shipping inspectors. That could mean contraband, but it could also mean goods that were technically legal, but being moved in ways that avoided taxes or regulations. Counterfeit items, unlicensed imports, agricultural products that needed inspection. There were dozens of possibilities. Before they could speculate further, Keahi's radio crackled with Harbor Warden Kapena Kiwi's voice. Kapena stated he'd been reviewing recent marine traffic reports and harbor records, and he'd found something interesting. About 90 minutes ago, around 10 p.m., the Honolulu Harbor office had received a radio call from a fishing vessel named the Kealoha, reporting that they were experiencing engine trouble approximately 6 miles northwest of Kehe Point. The boat had requested a commercial tow, and Harbor Dispatch had contacted a local marine salvage company that had a tow vessel in the area. The salvage company reported that by the time they reached the coordinates given by the Kealoha, the fishing boat was no longer there and wasn't responding to radio calls. They assumed the boat had managed to restart their engine and made it back to port on their own, so they returned to base and filed a report about the wasted trip. Keahi and Pono exchanged glances. 6 miles northwest of Kahe Point was exactly the direction the aluminum boat had been heading when it disappeared into the darkness. A fishing vessel with engine trouble in that same area, at almost the exact time this beach operation was happening, seemed like too much of a coincidence. Kapena seemed to agree, because he added that he was checking harbor records to see if the Kealoha had actually returned to any official port tonight. If the boat had made it back to Honolulu or any of the other nearby harbors, there would be a record of it coming through the breakwater or tying up at a slip. If there wasn't a record, that meant the boat was either still out there, had gone to an unofficial landing site, or the whole engine trouble call had been a diversion. Pono asked Kapena to send over any registration information he had on the Kealoha, including the owner's name, home port, and last known position. Kapena confirmed he'd send everything through dispatch within the next few minutes. In the meantime, Pono suggested that he and Keahi drive south along the coast highway to see if they could locate where the 3 vehicles from the beach had accessed the main road. If they could find that point, there might be witnesses or security cameras in the area that caught the vehicles passing by. It was a long shot, but it was better than standing around on a beach waiting for evidence to disappear under the next high tide. They split up, with Pono taking the lead and Keahi following about a quarter-mile behind. The coast highway south of Kahe Point was lined with scattered homes, small businesses, and agricultural properties, most of them dark and quiet at this hour. They drove slowly, searching for any beach access road or break in the vegetation that might allow vehicles to climb up from the shoreline to the pavement. After about 15 minutes of searching, Pono's brake lights flashed and he pulled onto the shoulder. Keahi pulled in behind him and they both got out to investigate. What they found was a gated dirt road that led down toward the water through a property that appeared to be abandoned, or at least not actively maintained. The gate itself was secured with a chain and padlock, but the chain was hanging loose and the padlock was open. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt showed that at least 2 vehicles, possibly 3, had come through here recently. Pono photographed the gate and the tracks while Keahi walked a short distance down the road to see where it led. The road descended through overgrown brush for about 50 yards before opening onto a flat area above the beach, and from there, it looked like vehicles could easily drive down onto the sand itself. This was almost certainly the exit point the 3 vehicles had used after leaving the beach operation. The gate being unlocked suggested either the property owner was involved or someone had cut the lock earlier to prepare for tonight's activities. Pono called the dispatch and requested they pull property records for this address to find out who owned it and whether there were any current residents. Nalani acknowledged and stated she'd have that information within 10 minutes. While they waited, Keahi noticed something else about the property that seemed significant. There were no visible houses or structures from the road, which meant the property was essentially vacant land. That made it perfect for use as a clandestine access point because there was nobody here to witness vehicles coming and going at odd hours. The radio chirped again, this time with Harbor Warden Kapina Kiawi's voice carrying a note of urgency. He reported that he'd found the registration information for the Ke Aloha, and there were some serious red flags. The boat was registered to a corporation based in Honolulu, but when Kapena checked, that corporation had been dissolved for non-payment of taxes 6 months ago. The boat itself should have been seized by the state as part of the corporation's assets, but according to harbor records, that never happened. Even more interesting, the phone number listed on the Ke Aloha's emergency contact information had been disconnected, and the last known slip assignment for the boat was at a marina that had shut down almost a year ago. Essentially, the Ke Aloha was a ghost vessel, existing on paper but with no verifiable current owner or location. Pono asked if there was any history of the Ke Aloha being involved in previous incidents or investigations. Kapena stated he was checking that now, but preliminary records showed the boat had been cited twice in the past 3 years for minor violations, once for operating without proper running lights and once for anchoring in a restricted area. Both citations had been issued to different individuals, neither of whom matched the name on the original registration. That suggested the boat had changed hands informally without the proper transfer paperwork being filed, which wasn't uncommon with older fishing vessels but made it nearly impossible to track who actually controlled the boat at any given time. Dispatch came back with the property records for the gated road location. The land was owned by an estate trust that had been in probate for nearly 2 years following the death of the original owner. There were no current residents, and the property was being held pending resolution of some legal dispute between the deceased owner's heirs. That explained why the property appeared abandoned, and why nobody had reported the gate being tampered with. Essentially, the smugglers had found a piece of land that was in legal limbo and exploited it as an access point, knowing that there was nobody actively monitoring it. Keahi was starting to see a pattern emerge. The ghost boat, the abandoned property, the nighttime operation on an isolated beach, all of it pointed to a group that had carefully scouted locations and resources that existed in bureaucratic blind spots. These weren't random criminals improvising a plan. These were people who understood how official systems worked and had deliberately chosen their assets to avoid official oversight. That level of sophistication suggested organization and experience, which in turn suggested this wasn't a one-time event. If this group had run this operation once, they'd likely done it before and would do it again. Pono reached the same conclusion and stated they needed to escalate this to the department's Criminal Investigation Division. What had started as a suspicious activity call had evolved into something that potentially involved ongoing smuggling operations, maritime law violations, and the use of abandoned or improperly registered assets to facilitate criminal activity. Neither he nor Keahi had the resources or jurisdiction to investigate all of those angles themselves. They needed detectives, Marine unit support, and possibly coordination with federal agencies if this crossed state or territorial boundaries. As if on cue, dispatcher Nalani Maho radioed with information that would complicate everything even further. She'd been reviewing the timeline of events and had noticed something odd. The call reporting suspicious activity at Kehe Point had come in at 11:17 p.m. But according to the harbor records Kapena had provided, the Kealoha's distress call about engine trouble had been logged at 9:53 p.m., more than an hour earlier. If the fishing boat and the beach operation were connected, that meant the boat had made its distress call and established an alibi for being in the area long before the actual transfer of goods happened on the beach. That suggested a level of planning and timing that went beyond simple smuggling. It suggested someone had coordinated the entire operation across multiple locations and times, possibly with people stationed at different points to act as lookouts or diversions. Keahi felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean wind. He realized they might be looking at the visible edge of something much larger and more organized than a simple boat smuggling cargo between islands. The question was what came next. The people involved tonight were gone, scattered to different locations with their cargo, and tracking them down would require resources and time that he and Pono simply didn't have on a midnight shift. But they also couldn't just walk away from this and hope someone else would pick up the investigation. Too many things didn't add up, and his instincts told him that whatever had happened tonight, it would happen again unless someone stopped it. Pono seemed to read Keahi's thoughts and stated they'd do everything by the book. They'd document the scene, collect what evidence they could, file a comprehensive report, and turn everything over to the investigators who would handle it during business hours. It wasn't satisfying, but it was procedure. And procedure existed for a reason. Sometimes the job meant being patient and trusting that the system would work, even when every instinct screamed to take immediate action. Keahi nodded his agreement, though a part of him wondered if waiting until morning would mean losing whatever slim advantage they might have had in tracking down the people responsible for tonight's operation. As they prepared to leave the property and return to their patrol areas, Keahi took one last look down the dirt road toward the dark ocean beyond. Somewhere out there, a boat with no official owner was carrying cargo that someone had been willing to risk arrest to move. And somewhere on this island, people were waiting to receive that cargo and distribute it to whatever market it was destined for. The thought sat heavy in his mind as he climbed back into his patrol vehicle and followed Pono's taillights back toward the coast highway, leaving the abandoned property and its secrets behind in the darkness. The morning briefing at the district station started at 7 a.m. sharp, just as the first gray light was spreading across the parking lot. Deputy Keahi Kealoha had been awake for nearly 24 hours straight, surviving on coffee and adrenaline, but he wasn't about to miss this meeting. Sergeant Pono Kahananui had called it specifically to discuss the previous night's incident at Kehe Point, and Keahi knew that what happened in this room over the next hour would determine whether their observations led to a real investigation or just became another report buried in a filing cabinet. The station's conference room smelled like burnt coffee and the faint must of old carpet, fluorescent lights humming overhead, as officers filtered in with tired expressions and styrofoam cups clutched in their hands. Pono stood at the front of the room with a dry erase marker in one hand and Keahi's incident report in the other. He'd printed out several copies and distributed them to the assembled officers, most of whom were scanning the pages with varying degrees of interest. The day shift supervisor was there, along with two other deputies who worked the coastal patrol routes, and Harbor Warden Kapina Kiao, who'd driven in from the Marine Division office specifically for this briefing. Kapena looked like he'd gotten even less sleep than Keahi, his eyes bloodshot and his uniform showing signs of having been slept in, but his attention was completely focused on the case details Pono was beginning to outline on the whiteboard. Pono started with the timeline, writing out the key events in chronological order. 9:53 p.m., the Kealoha reports engine trouble 6 miles northwest of Key Point. 11:17 p.m., anonymous caller reports suspicious activity at Kahi Point Beach. 11:45 p.m., Keahi arrives on scene and observes 3 vehicles and 1 small aluminum boat engaged in apparent cargo transfer. 12:03 a.m., subjects flee by land and sea after detecting law enforcement presence. 12:21 a.m., Keahi and Pono locate probable vehicle exit point at abandoned property on Coast Highway. The timeline laid out like that made the coordination obvious, and several officers in the room were already nodding as they recognized the pattern. One of the day shift deputies raised her hand and asked the obvious question: what was in the packages? Pono shook his head and admitted they didn't know. Keahi had only seen them from a distance in poor lighting conditions, wrapped in dark material and roughly the size of milk crates. Could be drugs, could be stolen electronics, could be counterfeit goods, could be any number of illegal or semi-legal items that someone wanted to move without official scrutiny. Without intercepting the cargo or finding where it was delivered, they were stuck guessing. But Pono emphasized that what they did know was almost as important as what they didn't. They knew this was organized. They knew it involved maritime transport, and they knew the perpetrators had used ghost assets like the dissolved corporation's boat and the abandoned property to minimize their official footprint. Harbor Warden Kapena Kiwi cleared his throat and asked if he could add some information he'd discovered after the initial radio traffic last night. Pono nodded and gestured for him to continue. Kapena stood and walked to the front of the room, pulling a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. He explained that after filing his initial report on the Kealoha situation, he'd spent the rest of the night going through historical harbor records looking for any other incidents involving vessels with similar characteristics. What he found was disturbing. Over the past 18 months, there had been 7 separate reports of fishing vessels or small commercial boats reporting various types of mechanical trouble or distress calls in the waters between Kah Point and Makua Beach, which was about 12 miles up the coast. In every single case, the boats had either resolved their problems and returned to port before help arrived, or they'd simply disappeared from radio contact and were later reported as having made it back safely through unofficial channels. None of the boats involved had been inspected after their reported distress, and none of the incidents had been serious enough to warrant Coast Guard involvement. But when Kapena plotted all 7 locations on a nautical chart, they formed a rough line paralleling the western coast of Oahu, all of them between 4 and 8 miles offshore. That was exactly the kind of distance that would put a vessel beyond casual observation from land, but still close enough for small boats to make the trip back and forth in reasonable time. Even more interesting, Kapena continued, was that 5 of those 7 vessels shared characteristics with the Kealoha. They were registered to corporations that had either been dissolved, were in legal disputes, or had ownership structures so complicated that it was difficult to determine who actually controlled them. 2 of the boats had been cited in the past for minor violations, but had never been followed up on because the cited individuals couldn't be located for the resulting court appearances. 1 boat had been reported stolen 3 years ago, but then mysteriously showed up back at its home marina 6 months later with no explanation and no charges filed. The pattern suggested a deliberate strategy of using vessels that existed in bureaucratic gray areas where nobody was quite sure who owned them or who was responsible for them. The room had gone very quiet as Kapena laid out this information. The day shift supervisor, a veteran officer who'd been with the department for almost 20 years, finally spoke up and asked the question everyone was thinking. If this pattern had been going on for 18 months, why was this the first time anyone was connecting the dots? Capena's expression tightened, and he admitted that the Marine Division had limited resources, and that until last night, none of these individual incidents had seemed significant enough to warrant deeper investigation. Distress calls that resolved themselves were common, especially with older fishing vessels that frequently had mechanical issues. It was only when Keahi had observed an actual cargo transfer operation that the pattern became visible for what it likely was, a systematic smuggling network using distress calls as cover for rendezvous points. Sergeant Pono Kahananui took back control of the briefing and stated that regardless of how long this had been happening, they now had enough information to justify a formal investigation. He'd already contacted the department's Criminal Investigation Division, and a detective was being assigned to the case as of this morning. In the meantime, Pono wanted increased patrol presence along the western coast, particularly in the Kahe Point to Makua Beach corridor. He emphasized that officers should note any unusual activity near beach access roads, any vehicles parked in isolated areas after dark, and any reports of boat traffic that seemed out of the ordinary for normal fishing or recreational activity. He also directed Capena to coordinate with the Coast Guard and see if they could increase their presence in the offshore area where the suspected rendezvous points had been occurring. Keahi raised his hand and asked what they should do if they encountered another operation in progress. Should they attempt to intercept or observe and report like he'd done last night? Pono considered the question carefully before answering. He stated that officer safety was the priority, and that no one should attempt to confront multiple suspects in an isolated area without adequate backup. If another operation was observed, the responding officer should maintain a safe distance, gather as much information as possible including vehicle descriptions, boat identification numbers, and direction of travel, and then coordinate with dispatch to set up interdiction points where backup could arrive quickly. The goal was to gather intelligence and eventually make arrests with enough evidence to secure convictions, not to engage in confrontations that could get officers hurt. The briefing concluded with assignments for the day shift and instructions for everyone to review the incident report and familiarize themselves with the pattern Capena had identified. As officers filed out of the conference room, several stopped to speak with Keahi directly, asking follow-up questions about what he'd seen and offering their own theories about what might be getting smuggled. The consensus seemed to be leaning toward drugs, specifically crystal methamphetamine or cocaine, both of which had significant street value and justified the risk and complexity of a maritime smuggling operation. But Keahi couldn't shake the feeling that something about that theory didn't quite fit. The packages had been too large and too numerous for high-value drugs, which were usually transported in smaller, more concentrated quantities to minimize risk. After the briefing, Keahi was supposed to go home and get some sleep, but instead he found himself sitting in his patrol vehicle in the station parking lot, staring at his incident report and trying to figure out what was bothering him about this whole situation. The packages themselves kept nagging at him. They'd been uniform in size, wrapped identically, and handled with care but not excessive caution. That suggested something valuable enough to protect, but not so delicate that dropping one would be catastrophic. Electronics made sense from that perspective, but why smuggle electronics? Import duties existed, but they weren't so extreme that it would justify this level of operational complexity. Stolen goods were possible, but again, the volume seemed wrong. You didn't risk a multi-person operation involving boats and vehicles just to move a few $1,000s worth of stolen property. His radio crackled, breaking his train of thought. Dispatcher Nalani Meho was calling him directly, asking if he was still at the station. When he confirmed he was, she requested he come back inside because Harbor Warden Kapina Kiwi wanted to speak with him privately before he left for the day. Keahi acknowledged and walked back into the building, finding Kapena waiting for him in one of the small interview rooms the department used for witness statements. Kapena closed the door behind them and gestured for Keahi to sit, his expression serious enough that Keahi immediately knew this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. Kapena started by saying he appreciated Keahi's work last night, and that his observations had potentially broken open something that the Marine Division had been peripherally aware of, but hadn't been able to prove. Then he asked a question that caught Keahi off guard. Had Keahi noticed anything specific about the boat's direction of travel after it left Kahe Point? Keahi thought back and confirmed that the boat had been heading northwest, roughly paralleling the coast but staying well offshore. Kapena nodded slowly and pulled out a nautical chart, spreading it across the interview table. He pointed to Kahe Point and then traced a line northwest with his finger, stopping at a point about 8 miles offshore where multiple pencil marks indicated something significant. Kapena explained that this particular area of ocean had something interesting about it. The depth dropped off dramatically. Close to shore, the water was relatively shallow, maybe 40 to 60 feet deep, but at this point offshore, the ocean floor fell away to depths of over 300 feet in some places. That created a natural boundary that local fishermen and boaters were familiar with. And it also created an area where surface activity was difficult to observe from shore or from most patrol vessels because of the distance and the way the swells ran in deeper water. But what made this location particularly interesting was that it sat at the convergence of two current patterns, which made it a natural waypoint for anyone navigating between the western coast of Oahu and the other islands. Keahi was starting to understand where this was going, but he waited for Kapena to continue. The harbor warden stated that if someone wanted to establish a reliable rendezvous point for maritime transfers, this deep water area would be ideal. A larger vessel could sit there relatively safely, even in moderate seas, and smaller boats could make the trip from shore in 20 to 30 minutes, depending on conditions. The depth meant that if anything went wrong and cargo needed to be ditched quickly, it would sink to a depth where recreational divers couldn't reach it, and where recovery would be extremely difficult. And the distance from shore meant that even if someone on land noticed activity, they couldn't see enough detail to identify vessels or people involved. But here was the part that really troubled Kapena, and why he'd wanted to speak with Keahi privately. 3 months ago, the Coast Guard had investigated a report from a commercial fishing captain who claimed he'd nearly collided with an unlit vessel in this exact area at around 2 a.m. The fishing captain had been running with full navigation lights and radar, and his radar had picked up a large stationary contact that wasn't broadcasting any identification signal. When he got close enough to see the vessel with his spotlight, he described it as a commercial freighter of some kind, at least 100 feet long, sitting dark with no visible crew on deck. When he tried to hail them on the radio, he got no response. By the time he'd circled around to get a better look and possibly get close enough to read a name or registration number, the vessel had started its engines and moved away at high speed, disappearing into the darkness before the fishing captain could get any identifying information. The Coast Guard had searched the area the following day but found nothing, and without any identifying information about the mystery vessel, they couldn't pursue it further. The fishing captain had filed a formal report, mostly for his own protection in case something came of the incident later. But the whole thing had been filed away as unexplained and eventually forgotten. Now, with the pattern of distress calls and the confirmed cargo transfer operation, Kapena was starting to wonder if that dark freighter was the other half of the equation. If the small aluminum boats were picking up cargo from shore and taking it to a larger vessel offshore, that would explain the efficiency of the operation and why none of the small boats had been intercepted returning to harbor. They weren't returning to harbor at all. They were making deliveries to a mother ship that stayed in international waters, or at least far enough from shore to avoid casual observation. Keahi felt that chill again. the one that came from realizing a situation was much bigger than it initially appeared. If Capena's theory was correct, they weren't dealing with a simple inter-island smuggling operation. They were dealing with something that potentially involved international maritime traffic, which meant federal jurisdiction and possibly connections to organized crime networks that operated across multiple countries. That was way beyond the scope of what a county sheriff's department could handle alone. Capena seemed to read his thoughts and nodded grimly, stating that he'd already contacted the Coast Guard Investigative Service and requested they reopen the file on the dark freighter incident. He'd also reached out to federal partners to see if there were any ongoing investigations into maritime smuggling that might connect to what they were seeing here. Before Keahi could respond, his radio came alive again. This time, it was Sergeant Pono Kahananui's voice, and there was an urgency to it that made both Keahi and Capena immediately stand up. Pono was requesting all available units to respond to a location on the coast highway about 3 miles south of where Keahi had found the abandoned property gate last night. A resident had called in to report finding a body on the beach, male, apparent gunshot wounds, deceased for at least several hours based on the condition. The reporting party had stated the body was partially in the water, and personal effects found nearby suggested the victim might have been one of the people involved in some kind of boat or water activity. Keahi and Capena looked at each other for just a moment before both headed for the door. Keahi knew he should go home and sleep, that he'd been up for far too long and wasn't in any condition to respond to a death investigation. But the timing and location of this body couldn't be a coincidence. 3 miles south of the property gate, right in the corridor where the beach operation vehicles would have been traveling, and involving someone connected to water activity. This wasn't a random drowning or a fishing accident. This was connected to what he'd witnessed last night, and if there was even a chance that responding to this scene might provide answers about who was running the smuggling operation, Keahi wasn't about to sit it out. The drive to the scene took less than 10 minutes, even with morning traffic starting to build on the highway. When Keahi arrived, there were already 2 patrol vehicles on site, along with an ambulance and the medical examiner's van. The actual location of the body was about 50 yards down from the road, requiring a scramble down a rocky embankment to reach the narrow strip of beach below. Sergeant Pono Kahananui was already there, standing well back from the body to preserve the scene, and he waved Keahi over as soon as he appeared at the top of the embankment. The body was that of a male in his 30s, wearing dark clothing that was now soaked through from being partially submerged in the surf. 2 obvious gunshot wounds were visible, one to the chest and one to the upper back, suggesting the victim had been shot at least twice from different angles. The medical examiner was performing a preliminary assessment, carefully documenting the wounds and the position of the body, while photographers captured the scene from multiple angles. Personal effects scattered nearby included a wallet, a cell phone that was ruined from water exposure, and most significantly, a handheld marine radio that had been clipped to the victim's belt. Pono waited until Keahi was standing next to him before speaking quietly. He stated that the wallet contained identification for a local man with a known history of minor criminal offenses, mostly theft and receiving stolen property, but nothing that suggested he was involved in anything as organized as what they'd observed last night. The marine radio was interesting because it wasn't the kind of cheap consumer model that recreational boaters used. It was a commercial-grade unit, expensive and capable of longer-range communication than standard recreational radios. That suggested the victim was more than just casual labor hired for one job. He was someone who needed reliable communication equipment, which implied ongoing involvement in maritime activities. But what really caught Pono's attention was something the medical examiner had found during the preliminary examination. The victim had contusions and defensive wounds on his hands and forearms that appeared to be fresh, occurring within hours of death. That meant there had been a physical altercation before he was shot, suggesting this wasn't a simple execution or assassination. This was personal, or at least confrontational, with the victim having had time to struggle or fight with his attacker before being killed. The medical examiner had also noted that, based on body temperature and lividity patterns, time of death was likely between 1 and 4 a.m., which placed it in the window after the beach operation had scattered. Keahi processed this information and asked the obvious question: was this a falling out among the smuggling crew, or was this something else? Pono admitted he didn't know, but the timing and location suggested it was connected. His working theory was that after the operation was interrupted by law enforcement, the crew had split up and something had gone wrong. Maybe this victim had been blamed for not detecting Keahi's presence sooner, or maybe he'd been seen as a liability who might talk to police if he was caught. Either way, someone had decided he was better off dead, and they'd executed that decision within hours of the beach operation falling apart. The medical examiner finished her preliminary work and stood up, carefully peeling off her gloves as she approached Pono and Keahi. She confirmed the obvious. 2 gunshot wounds, likely 9mm based on the entry wound characteristics, fired from close range but not contact distance, probably 3 to 6 feet away, consistent with someone standing over or near the victim during an argument or confrontation. Time of death matched Pono's estimate of 1 to 4 a.m., with her best guess being closer to 2 or 3 a.m. based on the degree of rigor mortis and environmental factors. She'd know more after the autopsy, but preliminary cause of death was pretty straightforward. Exsanguination from the chest wound, which had likely hit the heart or a major vessel. As the body was being prepared for transport, Keahi walked the immediate area looking for anything that might have been missed in the initial response. The beach was rocky and uneven, making it difficult terrain for any kind of detailed search, but he eventually found something interesting about 20 feet from where the body had been lying. 2 9mm shell casings, partially buried in the sand but still visible if you knew what you were looking for. He marked the location and called over one of the evidence technicians, who photographed and collected the casings. Finding spent brass meant the shooting had happened right here on this beach, not somewhere else with the body being dumped here afterward. That suggested the victim had been brought to this location specifically, possibly because it was isolated, or because it was on the route the perpetrator was taking anyway. Harbor Warden Kapina Kiwi had arrived at the scene while Keahi was searching for evidence, and now he approached with his own observation. He'd been looking at the water conditions and the tide charts, and he noted that at the estimated time of death, this section of beach would have been at high tide. That meant if the perpetrator had wanted to make the body disappear, they could have simply dragged it into deeper water and let the current carry it away. The fact that they hadn't suggested either they were interrupted before they could complete that task, or they didn't care whether the body was found. Given how organized and careful the smuggling operation had been, the latter option seemed more likely. Someone had made a decision that this victim's death needed to be visible, either as a message to others in the crew, or simply because hiding it wasn't worth the additional risk and effort. Sergeant Pono Kahananui called everyone together for a quick scene briefing before they released the location. He stated that this was now officially a homicide investigation tied to a suspected smuggling operation, which meant it would be handled by the Criminal Investigation Division, with support from both the Patrol Division and the Marine Unit. All evidence from the scene would be processed as priority, and the victim's identity would be used to start building a profile of who else might have been involved in last night's beach operation. Phone records, known associates, financial transactions, anything that might connect this victim to other people or to the vessels and vehicles that had been involved. As the various units began clearing the scene, Keahi finally accepted that he needed to go home and get some actual sleep. He'd been running on fumes for hours, and his judgment was starting to suffer from exhaustion. but as he drove away from the beach where a man had been killed for his involvement in a smuggling operation that was still barely understood, he couldn't stop thinking about what Harbor Warden Kapina Q had said about the dark freighter. If that vessel was real, if it was still operating in the waters off Oahu, then this death wasn't the end of the investigation. It was just the beginning, and somewhere out there people were already planning their next operation, learning from the mistakes of last night and preparing to try again. The only question was whether law enforcement could identify and stop them before someone else ended up dead on a lonely stretch of beach, their body left as a message that some secrets were worth killing to protect. Deputy Keahi Kealoha woke up at 3 in the afternoon to the sound of his phone vibrating against the nightstand. He'd managed maybe 4 hours of sleep, his mind refusing to fully shut down even after the exhaustion of the previous night and morning. The caller ID showed Sergeant Pono Kahananui, and Keahi answered with a voice still thick with sleep. Pono got straight to the point. The Criminal Investigation Division wanted Keahi to come in early for his shift tonight because they had new information about the homicide victim, and they needed someone who'd actually witnessed the beach operation to help make sense of what they were finding. Keahi agreed and said he'd be there by 5, giving himself enough time to shower, eat something resembling a meal, and mentally prepare for what was clearly going to be another long night. The district station was busier than usual when Keahi arrived, with several unmarked detective vehicles parked in spaces normally reserved for patrol units. Inside, the conference room had been converted into a temporary investigation headquarters, with photographs pinned to boards, maps spread across tables, and multiple laptop computers displaying what looked like phone records and financial documents. The lead detective on the case was a woman Keahi had worked with before on a burglary investigation, someone with a reputation for being thorough and not easily distracted by dead ends or false leads. She nodded at Keahi as he entered and gestured for him to sit at the main table where several other officers were already assembled. The detective started by confirming what everyone in the room already knew. The victim from the beach had been identified through fingerprints and wallet identification as a local man with a criminal history. But what had emerged from the investigation over the past 12 hours was significantly more interesting than his arrest record suggested. The victim's cell phone, despite being water damaged, had been sent to the department's digital forensics specialist who'd managed to extract some data from the SIM card before the corrosion became too severe. What they found was a series of text messages exchanged over the past 3 weeks that appeared to be coordinating some kind of schedule, using coded language that wasn't sophisticated enough to withstand serious scrutiny, but was probably adequate for keeping casual observers from understanding what was being discussed. The messages referenced things like fishing trips and equipment maintenance and weather windows, all of which sounded innocuous on the surface, but took on different meanings when you knew the victim had been involved in a smuggling operation. More significantly, the messages had been exchanged with 3 different phone numbers, none of which were registered to names that appeared in any law enforcement databases. That suggested burner phones or phones registered under false identities, which was exactly the kind of operational security you'd expect from people running an organized criminal enterprise. The detective had already subpoenaed the call records for those numbers, but that process would take time, and even then, burner phones were notoriously difficult to track back to actual users. What was more immediately useful was the financial information the investigation had uncovered. The victim's bank account showed regular deposits over the past 6 months, always in amounts between $800 and $1,500, and always made in cash at ATM machines scattered across the western side of Oahu. The deposits came every 2 to 3 weeks with no apparent pattern to the exact timing, but they were consistent enough to represent some kind of regular income. The amounts were significant, but not so large that they would automatically trigger bank reporting requirements, which suggested someone understood the financial system well enough to structure their payments to avoid official scrutiny. But here was the interesting part, and the reason the detective had wanted Keahi's input specifically. When they cross-referenced the dates of the victim's cash deposits against Harbor Warden Kapina Kiwi's list of suspicious maritime distress calls over the past 18 months, 7 of those deposit dates fell within 48 hours of reported incidents. That couldn't be coincidence. It meant the victim had been paid shortly after participating in operations, which in turn meant the beach transfer Keahi had witnessed was almost certainly not a one-time event. This had been going on for months, maybe longer, with the victim serving as regular crew for multiple smuggling runs. Keahi studied the timeline the detective had constructed, noting the intervals between operations, and trying to identify any pattern that might help predict when the next one would occur. The gaps ranged from 9 days to 23 days, with no obvious correlation to moon phases, weather patterns, or any other environmental factor he could identify. That suggested the timing was driven by operational needs rather than external conditions, meaning when cargo needed to be moved, that's when operations happened. If they could figure out what was triggering those operational needs, they might be able to anticipate the next smuggling run and actually intercept it. Sergeant Pono Kahananui spoke up from his position near one of the evidence boards, asking if there had been any progress on identifying the 3 vehicles from the beach or tracking down the aluminum boat. The detective shook her head and admitted that particular trail had gone cold. Without plate numbers or better vehicle descriptions, finding 3 pickup trucks and a van on an island with thousands of similar vehicles was essentially impossible. The boat was equally problematic because Keahi's description could have matched dozens of aluminum fishing boats currently registered in Hawaii, and without a hull number or other identifying marks, they had no way to narrow down which specific boat had been used. However, the detective continued, Harbor Warden Kapina Q had made progress on another front. He'd been coordinating with the Coast Guard and had managed to get them to pull historical radar data for the offshore area where the suspected rendezvous point was located. Radar installations at several points along the coast continuously recorded maritime traffic, but the data was usually only reviewed if there was a specific incident or investigation. Kapena had convinced them this qualified, and the Coast Guard had provided 3 months of radar recordings covering the deep water area northwest of Cay Point. Kapena himself entered the conference room at that moment, carrying a laptop and looking like he'd gotten even less sleep than Keahi. He set up the computer and connected it to the room's projection system, bringing up a grainy radar display that showed the coastline at the bottom and a field of contacts scattered across the screen. He explained that what they were looking at was a composite view of all maritime traffic in the area over a 72-hour period 3 weeks ago, which corresponded to one of the dates when the victim had received a cash payment and when there had been a suspicious distress call reported. Kapena began filtering the data, removing contacts that could be identified as commercial vessels with active transponders, fishing boats operating in known areas, and recreational traffic that followed typical patterns. What remained, after all those filters were applied, was a smaller set of unidentified contacts, and one in particular caught everyone's attention. It was a large vessel, probably 80 to 100 feet based on the radar signature, that had appeared in the deep water area around midnight and remained stationary for approximately 3 hours before moving away to the northwest at a speed consistent with a commercial freighter. The vessel hadn't been broadcasting any identification transponder, and its position placed it almost exactly at the suspected rendezvous point. Even more significant, Kapena continued, was that when he ran the same analysis for the other 6 dates that correlated with the victim's payments and suspicious distress calls, the same pattern appeared every single time. A large, unidentified vessel would arrive in the deep water area, remain stationary for 2 to 4 hours, and then depart to the northwest. The timing varied, sometimes occurring just after midnight. Other times not until 3 or 4 in the morning. But the pattern was consistent. This wasn't random maritime traffic. This was a vessel that was deliberately positioning itself in that specific location on a regular schedule to receive cargo from smaller boats making runs from shore. The detective leaned forward and asked the question everyone was thinking. Could they identify the vessel? Capena's expression suggested the answer wasn't going to be satisfying. He explained that without a transponder signal, identifying a specific vessel from radar signature alone was extremely difficult. The size and shape could narrow it down to a general class of vessel, probably a small freighter or large fishing processor, but there were hundreds of such vessels operating in Pacific waters at any given time. The Coast Guard could potentially identify it if they happened to encounter it during a routine patrol, but without knowing the vessel's schedule or route beyond these brief appearances off Oahu, the chances of a random encounter were minimal. However, Capena added, there was one potentially useful piece of information. The vessel's departure heading was consistently to the northwest, and at the speed it was traveling, it would reach the waters near Kauai in approximately 8 to 10 hours. If it was making regular runs between islands, that might explain the operational pattern. Pick up cargo off Oahu, transit to Kauai or beyond. Return for the next pickup when more cargo was ready. That would also explain why the intervals between operations varied. They were dependent on how long it took to accumulate enough cargo to justify the risk of a run and the cost of operating the vessel. One of the other deputies in the room raised a practical question. If they knew the approximate schedule and the rendezvous point, why not just position a Coast Guard vessel or police boat there during the next expected window and intercept the operation? The detective fielded that question by explaining the legal and practical problems with that approach. First, they didn't know exactly when the next operation would occur, only that it would probably happen within the next week or two based on the historical pattern. Second, the rendezvous point was far enough offshore that it might be in federal waters depending on exactly where the transfer took place, which complicated jurisdiction. Third, and most importantly, they had no direct evidence that the large vessel was actually receiving smuggled cargo. All they had was radar data showing an unidentified vessel in an area where they suspected smuggling was occurring. What they needed, the detective stated, was to either catch an actual transfer in progress with enough evidence to prove criminal activity, or to identify and track the cargo from source to destination and build a conspiracy case that way. The first option required luck and timing. The second option required resources and patience. Given the department's limited budget and the fact that this case was competing with dozens of other investigations for attention and funding, the realistic approach was probably to focus on building the conspiracy case through traditional detective work, identifying other crew members, tracking financial flows, finding where cargo was being staged before the beach transfers, and locating where it was being delivered after the offshore rendezvous. Sergeant Pono Kahananui suggested another approach that might complement the detective work. Increase visible patrol presence along the western coast and make it clear through word of mouth that law enforcement was aware of smuggling activity in the area. Sometimes, the best way to disrupt an operation wasn't to arrest everyone involved, but to make the operation too risky and expensive to continue. If the smugglers knew they were being watched, they might shut down temporarily or permanently, or they might make mistakes trying to work around the increased scrutiny. Either outcome was acceptable if it stopped the criminal activity, even if it didn't result in arrests. The detective considered that suggestion and nodded slowly. She agreed it was worth trying, but she cautioned against tipping their hand too obviously. If the smugglers felt immediate heat, they might just pause operations for a few months and then resume once the attention died down. What would be more effective was a sustained, visible presence that didn't seem specifically targeted at them, just routine patrol work that happened to be occurring in the right places at the right times. make them constantly wonder if law enforcement was onto them without confirming it, and let that psychological pressure do the work of disrupting their operations. Keahi volunteered to take the lead on the increased coastal patrols, noting that he already knew the area well and had established relationships with some of the local fishermen and residents who might notice unusual activity. Pono approved the assignment and stated that Keahi would coordinate with 2 other deputies to ensure coverage during the peak hours when previous operations had occurred, roughly 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. They'd vary their routes and timing enough to avoid being predictable, but they'd maintain consistent visibility in the areas of greatest interest, particularly around Kehe Point and the abandoned property that had been used as a vehicle access point. As the meeting was breaking up and officers were heading out to begin their shifts, Harbor Warden Kapena Kiwi pulled Keahi aside for a private word. He mentioned that he'd been reviewing the victim's maritime radio that had been recovered from the beach, and the forensics team had managed to get it working long enough to check what frequencies it had been programmed to receive. Most of them were standard maritime channels, but there was one frequency that didn't match any official use he was aware of. It was in a range that was technically allocated for private commercial use, meaning anyone could get a license to operate on it. But the specific frequency wasn't registered to any company or organization in Hawaii, according to the FCC database. Kapena suggested that frequency might be how the smuggling crew was coordinating during operations, using a channel they thought wouldn't be monitored because it wasn't associated with any legitimate business or marine service. He'd programmed his own radio to monitor that frequency, and he recommended Keahi do the same. If another operation was being planned, there might be test transmissions or coordination chatter in the days leading up to it, and monitoring that frequency could provide advance warning. It was a long shot, but sometimes long shots paid off, especially when dealing with criminals who thought they were being clever with their communication security. Keahi thanked Kapena for the information and made a note to reprogram his patrol vehicle's radio to include that frequency in its scan rotation. Then he headed out to begin his shift, driving west from the station toward the coast as the sun was setting behind the mountains. The sky was layered in shades of orange and purple, the kind of tropical sunset that tourists paid thousands of dollars to experience. But Keahi barely noticed it. His mind was occupied with routes and timing, with the question of where he'd position himself tonight to have the best chance of observing any suspicious activity without being so obvious that he'd scare off anyone who might be planning another operation. He decided to start by visiting the abandoned property where the vehicle tracks had been found, just to see if there had been any new activity since the last time they'd checked it. The gate was still there, chain hanging loose, and Keahi got out to examine it more closely in the fading light. The padlock itself was interesting once he looked at it carefully. It wasn't cut or broken, it was simply unlocked, which meant either someone had a key or had picked it. Given the overall sophistication of the smuggling operation, he suspected the latter. The crew had probably scouted this location weeks in advance, figured out what kind of lock was on the gate, and either practiced picking it or had someone on the crew with the skills to open it quickly. He spent a few minutes walking the dirt road that led down toward the beach, looking for any evidence of recent vehicle traffic. The tracks from the night of the beach operation were still visible but fading, and he didn't see any new ones that suggested someone had been back since then. That was actually slightly surprising. He'd expected the crew might return to check the site or retrieve anything they might have left behind, but apparently they'd written this location off as compromised. That suggested discipline and good operational security, cutting losses and moving on rather than risking exposure by returning to a location that law enforcement now knew about. As darkness settled fully over the coast, Keahi returned to his patrol vehicle and began driving slowly along the highway, scanning beach access points and places where vehicles might pull off the road without being immediately visible. The traffic was light at this hour, mostly locals heading home from work and the occasional tourist who'd stayed late at one of the beaches further north. He checked in periodically with dispatcher Nalani Meho, confirming his position and status, and she updated him on the locations of the other deputies working the coastal patrol pattern tonight. Around 11 p.m., Keahi was parked in a turnout near Makua Beach, the northern end of the suspected smuggling corridor, when his radio crackled with activity on the special frequency Harbor Warden Kapena Kio had told him about. It wasn't voice traffic, just a brief burst of static that lasted maybe 2 seconds, then silence. He waited, listening intently, and 30 seconds later it happened again. Another burst, same duration, same character. It didn't sound like someone trying to communicate. It sounded like someone testing equipment, making sure a radio was working and could be heard by someone else listening on the same frequency. Keahi immediately called it in to dispatcher Nalani Maho on his regular radio, describing what he'd heard and asking if any of the other units working tonight were picking up the same thing. Nalani checked with the other deputies and reported back negative. Nobody else was hearing anything unusual. That could mean Keahi was the only one whose radio was programmed for that frequency. Or it could mean the transmission was localized enough that only someone in this specific area could receive it. Either way, it suggested someone was preparing for something, checking their equipment and making sure their communications would work when they needed them. For the next 2 hours, Keahi remained at his position, monitoring the special frequency and occasionally hearing those brief test bursts. They came at irregular intervals, sometimes 5 minutes apart, other times 20 minutes or more. But they were consistent enough to convince him this wasn't natural interference or random noise. Someone was keying a microphone, transmitting just long enough to generate a carrier signal that could be detected, then releasing it. Classic radio check procedure, used by everyone from military units to commercial security teams to make sure their equipment was functioning without actually broadcasting any content that could be intercepted and understood. At 1:15 a.m., the pattern changed. Instead of a brief burst, Keahi heard actual voice traffic on the special frequency. It was scratchy and broken up by static, but he could make out enough words to understand the gist of the message. Someone was confirming weather conditions acceptable, and stating window opens at 0300. Then a different voice acknowledged, and the transmission ended. Keahi's heart rate picked up as he processed what he'd just heard. This wasn't preparation or testing. This was an actual operation being coordinated, and it was scheduled to begin in less than 2 hours. He immediately radioed Sergeant Pono Kahananui directly, breaking protocol by not going through dispatch first, but the situation justified it. He reported the radio intercept and stated his belief that another smuggling operation was imminent, probably occurring somewhere in the coastal corridor between his current position and Kehe Point. Pono acknowledged and stated he was en route to Keahi's location, then began coordinating with the other deputies working tonight to set up a loose net that could respond quickly once they identified where the operation was actually taking place. He also contacted Harbor Warden Kapena Kiu, waking him up at home, and requested he get to the Marine Unit office and prepare to coordinate any waterside response that might be needed. Keahi knew he had to move carefully now. If the smugglers were monitoring police radio traffic, which any competent criminal would be doing, they'd hear the increased coordination and might abort the operation. But he also couldn't just sit here and do nothing while an active smuggling run was being prepared somewhere along 12 miles of coastline. He made a decision to begin slowly driving south toward Kahe Point, moving like he was on normal patrol, stopping occasionally to check beach access points and turnouts like he'd been doing all night. Anyone watching would see routine law enforcement activity, not a focused response to intelligence about an imminent operation. As he drove, Keahi continued monitoring the special frequency, hoping for another transmission that might give away the specific location. At 2:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the stated window was supposed to open, he got what he was listening for. Another voice transmission, this one clearer because he was apparently closer to whoever was broadcasting. The message was simple: package ready for transfer at Mark II. Mark II meant nothing to Keahi, but it obviously meant something to whoever received the message because a different voice immediately acknowledged with, "Understood, Mark II. Confirm approach from primary." Keahi grabbed his phone and called Sergeant Pono Kahananui directly, rather than using the radio. He reported the new transmission and the reference to Mark II, asking if that meant anything to Pono based on his knowledge of the area. There was a brief pause while Pono consulted a map. Then he came back with a suggestion. Local fishermen sometimes referred to the old territorial-era navigation markers that were still visible along parts of the coast. Most of them just concrete posts or stone cairns that had been used decades ago before modern GPS made them obsolete. Mark II could be referring to the second such marker south of Makwa Beach, which, if Pono remembered correctly, was located near a small cove about 2 miles north of Kihei Point. That location made sense tactically. It was isolated, had beach access through another abandoned property similar to the one they'd found before, and was positioned right in the middle of the suspected smuggling corridor. Keahi confirmed he was heading there now and estimated arrival in less than 10 minutes. Pono stated he was also en route and would approach from the south to box in the area, with the third deputy positioning himself on the highway to watch for any vehicles trying to leave the area quickly. The net was being set, and if they timed it right, they might actually catch the smuggling crew in the middle of their operation, instead of just finding evidence after they'd fled. Deputy Keahi Kealoha killed his headlights a quarter-mile before reaching the suspected location, letting his patrol vehicle coast through the darkness on nothing but ambient moonlight and the faint glow of distant street lamps. The highway was completely deserted at this hour, which meant any approaching vehicle would be immediately obvious to anyone watching from the beach area below. He couldn't risk driving straight to the access point, so instead he pulled into a residential driveway about 300 yards north of where he estimated the old navigation marker would be. The house was dark and set back from the road, giving him cover to exit his vehicle and proceed on foot. Before leaving the patrol car, Keahi checked his equipment one more time. Service weapon secured, flashlight attached to his belt but turned off, radio volume lowered to barely audible, and switched to the earpiece so any transmissions wouldn't give away his position. He also grabbed the department's night vision monocular from the equipment bag in his trunk, a piece of gear that rarely got used but which seemed absolutely necessary tonight. Then he began moving south along the highway shoulder, staying low and using the sparse vegetation as cover whenever possible. The terrain here was rocky and uneven, typical of the western Oahu coast, with patches of scrub grass and the occasional kiawe tree breaking up the volcanic soil. The special radio frequency crackled in his earpiece again, another brief transmission that sounded like someone confirming position. Keahi paused to listen, but the message was too short and garbled to make out clearly. Still, the fact that there was active radio traffic meant the operation was definitely underway, which gave him confidence he was moving toward the right location. He continued south, moving carefully to avoid dislodging loose rocks that might tumble down the slope and alert anyone below to his presence. The ocean was visible below him now, a vast expanse of darkness broken only by the white foam of waves hitting the rocky shoreline. After about 5 minutes of careful movement, Keahi spotted what he was looking for. Fresh tire tracks leading off the highway and down a steep access road that was barely more than 2 parallel ruts worn into the hillside. He knelt at the edge of the road and used the night vision monocular to scan the beach area below. What he saw made his pulse quicken. 3 vehicles were parked in a triangular formation near the waterline, exactly like the setup he'd witnessed at Kihei Point. 2 pickup trucks and what looked like the same commercial van, though at this distance and in these lighting conditions he couldn't be certain they were the same specific vehicles. But the operational pattern was identical, which meant this was definitely the smuggling crew. Movement near the vehicles caught his attention, and he adjusted the monocular to get a better view. At least 6 people were visible, moving between the trucks and carrying objects that appeared to be the same size and shape as the wrapped packages from the previous operation. But this time there was no boat pulled up on the shore. Instead, the people were stacking the packages in what looked like a staging area, arranging them in neat rows like they were preparing for pickup rather than immediate loading. That suggested the boat hadn't arrived yet, which made sense given that the radio transmission had said the window opened at 0300 hours. It was currently only 2:58, so they were probably waiting for the marine element to arrive before beginning the actual transfer. Keahi needed to update Sergeant Pono Kahananui on what he was seeing, but he couldn't risk a radio transmission that might be overheard. Instead, he pulled out his cell phone and sent a text message with his exact location and a count of vehicles and personnel visible. He added that no boat had arrived yet, but that the crew appeared to be preparing for one. Pono's reply came back within seconds. He was approximately 4 minutes out and would approach with lights off from the south. The third deputy was in position on the highway to the north, blocking that escape route. Harbor Warden Kapina Kiwi was monitoring from the Marine Unit office and had a patrol boat on standby if they needed water support, though it would take at least 20 minutes to reach this location from the nearest harbor. The waiting was the hardest part. Keahi remained in position, watching through the night vision monocular as the crew on the beach continued their preparations. They worked with practiced efficiency, no wasted motion, no standing around talking. These were people who had done this before and who understood that speed and silence were essential to avoiding detection. One person appeared to be acting as a lookout, standing slightly apart from the others and periodically scanning the highway above with what might have been binoculars. Keahi was glad he'd had the instinct to approach on foot rather than driving straight to the access road. If he'd come in with a vehicle, that lookout would almost certainly have spotted him. At exactly 3:02 a.m., Keahi heard the faint sound of an outboard motor approaching from the north. He shifted his observation point to scan the water and quickly spotted a small boat, running with no lights, making its way along the coast at what looked like a cautious speed. The boat matched the description of the aluminum vessel from the K Point operation, though again he couldn't be certain it was the same specific boat. What mattered was that the marine element had arrived, which meant the transfer was about to begin. This was the moment when the crew would be most vulnerable, focused on loading cargo and less likely to notice law enforcement moving into position. Keahi sent another quick text to Pono. "Boat arriving now. Estimate 5 minutes until transfer begins." Pono's response was immediate. "Am in position south side, waiting for your signal to move in." Keahi acknowledged and then made a decision. He was going to move closer to get a better vantage point and, if possible, photographic evidence of the transfer. The department's lawyers had been clear during training that cases like this lived or died on documentation. Witness testimony was valuable, but photos or video of the actual criminal act were exponentially more powerful in court. He switched his phone to camera mode and began carefully descending the slope toward the beach, using the sparse vegetation and rocky outcrops as cover. The boat had reached the shore now and was being pulled up onto the sand by 2 of the crew members. Keahi could see them more clearly now, all wearing dark clothing and moving with purpose. The person who'd been acting as lookout had joined the others, apparently deciding that the critical phase of the operation required all hands on deck. That was a mistake from a security perspective, but it was good news for Keahi, because it meant no one was specifically watching for approaching threats. He reached a position about 50 yards from the nearest vehicle, close enough to clearly see faces and details, and began taking photos with his phone. The night vision mode on the camera wasn't great, but it was better than nothing, and some documentation was infinitely better than none. The crew worked quickly, forming a human chain to pass the wrapped packages from the staging area to the boat. Keahi counted at least 15 packages being loaded, possibly more that he couldn't see clearly. The whole operation had a rhythm to it, almost mechanical in its efficiency. Package handed off, carried to boat, stacked in hull, return for next package. Nobody spoke that he could hear, all communication apparently happening through gestures and established procedure. He continued photographing, trying to capture clear images of faces and the packages and the boat's hull number if it was visible. The hull number would be crucial for tracking the boat later, assuming they didn't manage to intercept it tonight. Then, everything went wrong in the space of about 3 seconds. One of the crew members carrying a package stumbled on the uneven sand and dropped it. The package hit the ground with a solid thud that carried clearly in the quiet night air, and the wrapping partially tore open. Keahi's position didn't give him a clear view of what spilled out, but he saw the crew member's immediate reaction, which was to quickly surround the damaged package and shield it from view, while someone worked to rewrap it. But in that brief moment before they blocked his view, Keahi caught a glimpse of what appeared to be electronics, specifically what looked like high-end computer components, or maybe communication equipment. Multiple identical units, industrial packaging, not the kind of thing you'd buy at a consumer store. That changed his understanding of what they were dealing with here. This wasn't drugs or stolen property in the traditional sense. This looked like gray market electronics, possibly items being smuggled to avoid import duties or licensing requirements, or perhaps counterfeit components being moved to avoid detection by customs authorities. The volume made sense now too. These kinds of items had value, but needed to be moved in quantity to justify the operational costs. A single boatload of high-end counterfeit electronics could be worth tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars on the black market, especially if they were components that could be integrated into other products and sold as legitimate. While Keahi was processing this new information, the crew finished rewrapping the damaged package and resumed loading. They were moving even faster now, apparently spooked by the accident and wanting to complete the transfer as quickly as possible. The boat was nearly full, maybe 2 or 3 more packages to go, when Keahi's radio suddenly crackled with Sergeant Pono Kahananui's voice at a volume just slightly too loud for the earpiece setting. The voice was barely audible to Keahi, but in the dead quiet of the beach it might as well have been a shout. Every person in the smuggling crew froze simultaneously, heads turning to scan the area around them. For one long moment, nobody moved. Then the person who'd been acting as lookout earlier pointed directly at Keahi's position and shouted something Keahi couldn't make out. Immediately, the crew abandoned the remaining packages and scattered. 2 people sprinted for the pickup trucks, engines starting almost instantly. Another person jumped into the boat and yanked the outboard motor's starter cord. The remaining crew members were running in different directions, some heading for the vehicles and others running south along the beach on foot. It was chaos, the kind of panicked flight that came from knowing you were caught, and your only option was to get away as fast as possible. Keahi made a split-second decision. He couldn't stop all of them, but he could try to block the vehicles from leaving. He sprinted toward the access road, hoping to reach his patrol car and move it to block the exit before the trucks could make it up the steep slope. Behind him, he heard Sergeant Pono Kahananui's vehicle roaring to life and saw headlights blaze to life from the south, Pono moving in to cut off that escape route. But the northern truck was already moving, tires spinning in the loose sand as it accelerated toward the access road where Keahi had entered. Keahi reached the highway just seconds before the first truck came barreling up the access road. He managed to get his patrol vehicle started and was pulling forward to block the road when the truck emerged onto the pavement. The driver of the truck saw the patrol car and immediately jerked the wheel hard to the left, choosing to drive on the shoulder rather than be boxed in. Keahi tried to adjust his position to cut them off, but the truck was already past him, accelerating north along the highway with its lights off, and the driver clearly willing to take insane risks to avoid capture. Keahi activated his lights and siren and took off in pursuit, radioing to dispatcher Nalani Maho that he was in active pursuit of a suspect vehicle heading north on the coast highway. Nalani acknowledged and began coordinating additional units, but Keahi knew the nearest backup was at least 10 minutes away. He was on his own for now, chasing a vehicle driven by someone desperate enough to flee at high speed on a dark highway with no lights. The speedometer in his patrol car climbed past 70 miles per hour, then 80, and the truck ahead showed no signs of slowing down. This wasn't just someone trying to get away. This was someone who would rather risk dying in a crash than face arrest. The highway along this stretch of coast had been built decades ago and hadn't been significantly upgraded since. It was narrow, with no shoulder in many places, and featured sharp curves that were dangerous even at normal speeds. At 80+ miles per hour in the dark, those curves became potentially fatal. Keahi stayed with the pursuit but maintained enough distance that he could react if the truck lost control. Department policy was clear. The danger of a high-speed pursuit had to be weighed against the severity of the crime being investigated. But this wasn't just a traffic violation or petty theft. This was organized smuggling with potential ties to a homicide, which justified continuing the pursuit at least until backup arrived or the situation became so dangerous that termination was the only reasonable option. The truck's brake lights flashed red as it entered a particularly sharp curve, the vehicle leaning hard to the right as the driver fought to maintain control. Keahi slowed slightly, giving himself more reaction time, and watched as the truck barely made the turn and then accelerated again on the straightaway beyond. They were approaching the area where the highway climbed inland slightly, gaining elevation before descending again toward sea level. The terrain here was even more rugged, with steep drop-offs on the ocean side that would be absolutely unforgiving if a vehicle went over the edge. Then Keahi saw something that made his blood run cold. Another vehicle was approaching from the north, headlights visible in the distance. Probably some unlucky civilian who'd been working a night shift and was heading home along what should have been a quiet highway. The truck ahead wasn't slowing down, wasn't moving to the right to give the oncoming vehicle room to pass. If anything, the truck was accelerating, playing a deadly game of chicken with an innocent person who had no idea what they were about to encounter. Keahi immediately got on the radio and tried to warn the approaching vehicle, but there was no way to communicate with them directly. All he could do was watch in horror as the two vehicles raced toward each other. At the last possible second, the oncoming vehicle swerved hard to the right, the driver clearly realizing something was wrong. The truck flashed past on the wrong side of the road, missing a head-on collision by what couldn't have been more than a few feet. Keahi glimpsed the civilian driver's face as he passed, frozen in shock and terror, but there was no time to stop and check if they were okay. The pursuit was continuing, and now Keahi was absolutely certain that this driver was willing to kill innocent people to avoid capture. That changed the calculation. This couldn't be allowed to continue on a public highway where other civilians might be endangered. Keahi radioed his decision to dispatcher Nalani Maho. He was going to attempt a precision immobilization technique, commonly known as a pit maneuver, at the next safe location. Nalani acknowledged, but her voice carried a note of concern. PIT maneuvers were dangerous under the best circumstances, and attempting one at high speed on a dark highway was borderline reckless. But letting this pursuit continue until someone died was worse, and Keahi had been trained in the technique and had executed it successfully twice before in lower speed situations. He could do this. He had to do this. The highway ahead opened up into a slightly wider section where the terrain flattened out, providing maybe 100 yards of relatively straight road before the next curve. This was as good as it was going to get. Keahi accelerated, closing the distance between his patrol car and the fleeing truck. He could see the driver's silhouette now, hunched over the wheel, glancing repeatedly in the rearview mirror. The driver knew what was coming but couldn't do anything to prevent it. Keahi matched speed with the truck, positioned his front bumper just behind the rear wheel of the truck's passenger side, and then executed the maneuver. The patrol car made contact with the truck's rear quarter panel, and Keahi immediately steered toward the truck while accelerating slightly. Physics took over. The truck's rear end lost traction and began to slide, the vehicle rotating counterclockwise as the driver tried and failed to correct the spin. Keahi backed off, braking hard to avoid being caught in the rotation, and watched as the truck completed a full 180-degree spin before sliding backward off the highway. The vehicle dropped about 4 feet into a drainage ditch, the rear end hitting first and then the front slamming down as the truck came to rest at a steep angle. Keahi pulled his patrol car to a stop and immediately exited with his weapon drawn, approaching the crashed truck cautiously. The driver's door was already opening, and a figure stumbled out, clearly dazed from the impact. Keahi ordered the person to show their hands and get on the ground, his voice carrying the authority of someone who would not tolerate any resistance. The driver complied, dropping to their knees and then lying prone on the ground with hands visible. Within seconds, Keahi had the individual in handcuffs and was conducting a quick pat-down for weapons. No gun, but the driver had a cell phone and a wallet with identification showing a local address. Only then did Keahi take a moment to catch his breath and assess the situation. His hands were shaking from the adrenaline, and his heart was hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. He'd just executed a high-speed pursuit, culminating in a pity maneuver that could have gone catastrophically wrong if he'd misjudged the timing or the road conditions. But it had worked, and now he had one member of the smuggling crew in custody, which meant they had someone they could pressure for information about the rest of the operation. He radioed dispatcher Nalani Maho with an update. Pursuit terminated, suspect in custody, vehicle disabled, but driver appeared uninjured. Nalani acknowledged and confirmed that Sergeant Pono Kahananui was reporting the situation at the beach was also under control. One additional suspect had been apprehended trying to flee in the second truck, and the boat had been intercepted by Harbor Warden Kapina Kiwi's patrol vessel about a mile offshore. The remaining suspects who'd fled on foot were still at large, but with 3 people in custody and both the vehicles and the boat secured, this operation had been effectively shut down. As backup units began arriving and taking over the scene of Keahi's pursuit, he sat in his patrol car and tried to process everything that had just happened. They'd successfully interdicted an active smuggling operation, arrested multiple suspects, and seized both vehicles and cargo. This was a significant victory, the kind of case that would make for good press coverage and would likely result in commendations for everyone involved. But Keahi couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off about all of this. The operation had been too easy to disrupt once they'd figured out the timing and location. These people had been running successful smuggling operations for months, maybe longer, and they'd managed to avoid detection until now. Why had they suddenly become careless enough to get caught? The more he thought about it, the more Keahi suspected they were only seeing part of the picture. The boat, the vehicles, the crew on the beach, all of that was the visible operation, the tactical execution. But someone had to be coordinating from a higher level, someone who was arranging the cargo shipments, managing the finances, and making strategic decisions about when and where operations would occur. That person or persons weren't on the beach tonight. They were somewhere safe, watching from a distance, and they were probably already planning how to rebuild the operation now that this particular cell had been compromised. Sergeant Pono Kahananui pulled up in his patrol vehicle, parking behind Keahi's car and walking over with an expression that mixed satisfaction with concern. He'd been thinking along the same lines as Keahi, questioning whether tonight's success was actually a victory or just the disruption of one piece of a much larger enterprise. Pono stated that the detectives would be working overtime starting immediately, interrogating the arrested suspects and trying to build a case that reached beyond the street-level operatives. But he also acknowledged the reality that people running operations this sophisticated didn't get to that level by being sloppy about operational security. The chances of any of tonight's arrestees knowing enough to identify the true leadership of the smuggling network were probably minimal. As the eastern sky began to show the first hints of dawn, turning from black to deep purple, Keahi finally allowed himself to feel some of the exhaustion that had been building over the past 2 days. He'd been awake for nearly 40 hours, had witnessed 2 major law enforcement operations, and had just completed a high-speed pursuit that could have ended in disaster. He needed sleep, needed food, needed to step away from this case for at least a few hours and let his mind reset. But even as he drove back to the station to begin the lengthy process of writing reports and giving statements, part of his mind was still working on the puzzle, still trying to figure out who was really running this operation and how they could be caught before they simply rebuilt what had been disrupted tonight. 3 days after the beach interdiction, Deputy Keahi Kealoha sat in the same conference room where the investigation briefings had been held, but the atmosphere was markedly different now. What should have been a celebration of a successful operation had instead become a tense examination of uncomfortable questions that nobody seemed able to answer. The 3 suspects arrested that night had all lawyered up immediately and refused to provide any information beyond confirming their own names. The cargo recovered from the beach turned out to be exactly what Keahi had suspected: counterfeit, high-end computer components, specifically server processors and memory modules with forged authentication markings that made them appear to be legitimate products from major manufacturers. The street value of the seized cargo was estimated at somewhere north of $400,000, which should have made this a significant case worth prosecuting aggressively. But the district attorney's office had thrown cold water on that enthusiasm by pointing out some serious problems with how the evidence had been obtained. The initial observation at Cay Point was solid, but the interdiction at the second beach location had been based primarily on intercepted radio communications on a frequency that hadn't been specifically authorized for monitoring under existing warrant protocols. A good defense attorney could potentially argue that the radio intercept constituted an illegal search, which would poison the entire chain of evidence collected afterward. The lead detective on the case was clearly frustrated as she walked the assembled officers through the legal complications. She emphasized that nobody had done anything wrong from a policing perspective. They'd acted on probable cause and had conducted the operation by the book. But the book didn't always account for the complexities of modern communication technology and the Fourth Amendment protections that applied to electronic surveillance. The DA was still reviewing whether they could prosecute the case successfully, but the preliminary assessment was that they might end up having to let some or all of the arrested suspects walk on technicalities unless additional evidence could be developed independently of the radio intercept. Sergeant Pono Kahananui raised the obvious question. What about the homicide from the beach? That investigation didn't rely on any radio intercepts, just old-fashioned detective work connecting the victim to the smuggling operation. Couldn't they use that case as leverage to pressure the arrested suspects into cooperating? The detective shook her head and explained that the connection between the homicide and the arrested suspects was circumstantial at best. None of the 3 people in custody had any forensic connection to the murder scene. Their alibis for the time of death were shaky, but not provably false. And without cooperation from one of them, there was no way to establish who had actually pulled the trigger. Harbor Warden Kapina Kiu spoke up from his position near the back of the room, stating that his end of the investigation had hit similar walls. The boat intercepted offshore had turned out to be registered to yet another dissolved corporation, this one based in California, with ownership records so convoluted that tracking down who actually controlled the vessel would require months of legal work and probably interstate cooperation that the department simply didn't have resources for. The boat itself was being held as evidence, but unless they could tie it conclusively to the smuggling operation through forensics or witness testimony, it would eventually have to be released back to whoever could prove ownership. What really troubled Capina, though, was something he discovered while reviewing the radar data for the night surrounding the interdiction. The large, unidentified vessel that had been consistently appearing at the offshore rendezvous point hadn't shown up on the night of the operation. In fact, the last time it had appeared on radar was 4 days before the interdiction, and it hadn't been detected in Hawaiian waters since. That suggested someone had tipped off the operation's leadership before the beach transfer even began, giving them time to abort the offshore component while leaving the shore crew to take the fall. The only question was how they'd been warned. The detective asked if there was any evidence of compromised communications or leaked operational information. Capina stated he'd been reviewing that question with the department's technical specialists, and they'd found something concerning. The special radio frequency that Keahi had monitored, the one the smugglers had been using to coordinate, had shown unusual activity in the hours before the operation. Specifically, there had been a brief encrypted burst transmission that the specialists thought might have been a warning signal. The encryption wasn't sophisticated by military standards, but it was enough to prevent casual interception from revealing content, and the timing suggested it might have been a message warning that law enforcement was monitoring the frequency. Keahi felt his stomach tighten as he processed the implications. If someone had known that frequency was being monitored before the operation began, that meant either the smugglers had detected the monitoring somehow, or more troubling, someone with knowledge of the investigation had warned them. The detective seemed to read his thoughts and quickly stated that Internal Affairs had been notified and was conducting a quiet review of everyone who'd had access to operational information about the case. She emphasized that this was standard procedure for any investigation where information security might have been compromised, and nobody in the room should take it as an accusation. But the message was clear. Trust nobody, and be careful what you say and to whom you say it. The briefing concluded with assignments for follow-up work that everyone knew was probably futile. Interview the suspects again, review financial records, coordinate with federal partners who might have jurisdiction over the counterfeit electronics angle. All necessary steps, but unlikely to produce the breakthrough needed to salvage prosecutions against people who clearly knew how to exploit the system's weaknesses. As officers filed out of the conference room, Keahi noticed that people were making less eye contact than usual, everyone suddenly aware that there might be someone among them who couldn't be trusted. Keahi spent the rest of his shift on routine patrol, trying to focus on normal police work and not obsess over the smuggling case. But his mind kept returning to the pattern of events, looking for the detail he might have missed that would explain how the operation's leadership had known to abort the offshore rendezvous. The radio intercept was the obvious answer, but the timeline didn't quite work. The encrypted burst transmission had occurred before Keahi had even started monitoring the special frequency, which meant the warning couldn't have been triggered by his monitoring. Someone had sent that warning based on other information, perhaps just general awareness that law enforcement was becoming too interested in the western coastal corridor. Late in his shift, around 2 a.m., Keahi found himself driving past the location where they'd interdicted the beach operation. The site had been processed by evidence technicians and released, and now it looked like any other isolated stretch of rocky beach. No indication that just days ago this had been the scene of a significant law enforcement operation. He parked and walked down to where the vehicles had been positioned, trying to recreate the scene in his mind and see if there was anything they'd missed in the chaos of the arrests. The sand still showed faint impressions where the packages had been stacked, and he could see the marks where the boat had been pulled up onto shore. But everything else had been erased by wind and tide, nature's way of cleansing the beach of human activity. Keahi stood there for several minutes, listening to the waves and feeling the ocean breeze, and trying to understand why this case bothered him so much. They'd made arrests, seized contraband, disrupted a criminal operation. By any objective measure, this was a successful investigation, so why did it feel like they'd lost? His radio crackled with dispatcher Nalani Meho's voice, asking his location and status. He reported that he was conducting a routine area check and was preparing to resume patrol. Nalani acknowledged and then added something unusual. She stated that Harbor Warden Kapina Kiwi had called the station asking if Keahi could contact him directly when convenient, that it wasn't urgent, but Kapina wanted to discuss something related to the case. Keahi confirmed he'd make the call and then walked back to his patrol vehicle. His curiosity piqued about what Kapina might have discovered. He called Kapina's cell phone from his personal device rather than the department radio, a precaution that had become second nature given the concerns about information security. Kapina answered on the second ring, his voice tired but carrying an edge of intensity that suggested he'd found something significant. He stated he'd been doing more analysis of the radar data, going back further in time than he'd previously examined, and he'd discovered a pattern that troubled him deeply. The large, unidentified vessel that had been making regular appearances at the offshore rendezvous point had been operating in Hawaiian waters for at least 2 years, not just the 18 months they'd initially identified. And the vessel's pattern of appearances correlated not just with the smuggling operations they knew about, but with other incidents that hadn't previously been connected. Specifically, Kapena had cross-referenced the vessel's appearances with reports of missing cargo from legitimate shipping operations, instances of unexplained salvage claims, and even a couple of boating accidents that had resulted in insurance payouts. In every case, the unidentified vessel had been in the general area around the time of the incident, though never close enough to be definitively linked. But the statistical probability of these correlations being coincidental was essentially zero. What they were looking at wasn't just a smuggling operation. It was a maritime criminal enterprise that had been operating with near impunity for years, using the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean as cover and exploiting the limited resources of law enforcement agencies to avoid detection. Keahi asked the obvious question. If this vessel had been operating for that long, why hadn't it been identified or intercepted before now? Kapena's answer was blunt and uncomfortable, because nobody had been looking at the pattern comprehensively. Each incident had been investigated in isolation by different agencies with different jurisdictions, and nobody had connected the dots because the vessel was careful never to leave obvious evidence. It only showed up on radar during periods of heavy marine traffic when its presence wouldn't stand out. It never stayed in one area long enough to be tracked, and it appeared to have sophisticated knowledge of patrol patterns and surveillance capabilities. This was organized crime at a level that exceeded anything the local sheriff's department was equipped to handle alone. But here was the part that really concerned Kapena, and why he'd wanted to speak with Keahi directly rather than discuss it in the conference room. Some of the incidents that correlated with the vessel's appearances had occurred at times when law enforcement had been conducting specific operations or investigations in other areas, drawing resources away from marine patrol. The timing was too consistent to be random. Someone had been feeding information to the vessel's operators, telling them when it was safe to operate and when they needed to stay away, and that someone had access to law enforcement operational planning at a level that suggested they were either inside the department or had a source who was. Keahi felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. What Kapena was describing went beyond a compromised investigation. This was systematic corruption, someone actively protecting a criminal enterprise over an extended period. He asked if Kapina had shared this analysis with the lead detective or with Internal Affairs. Kapina stated he'd been trying to decide the best way to report it without triggering a response that would alert whoever the leak was. If the wrong people found out what he'd discovered, evidence could disappear. Witnesses could be intimidated, and the entire case could collapse even faster than it already was. They talked for another 10 minutes, Kapena walking through the specific correlations he'd identified, and Keahi asking questions about the methodology and confidence level of the analysis. By the end of the conversation, Keahi was convinced that Kapena was onto something real and dangerous. The question was what to do with the information. Going through normal channels risked alerting the person or persons who were compromised. But going outside normal channels could undermine the integrity of the investigation and make any eventual prosecutions vulnerable to defense challenges about chain of evidence and proper procedure. Keahi made a decision. He told Kapena to document everything he'd found, make multiple copies, and store them in secure locations that weren't connected to the department's systems. Then, they'd approach the district attorney directly, bypassing the detective squad and internal affairs entirely, and lay out what they'd discovered. The DA had independent authority to investigate and prosecute, and if there was corruption in the department, the DA's office was the appropriate entity to handle it. Kapena agreed with the approach and stated he'd have the documentation ready within 48 hours. They agreed to meet at a neutral location, not the station, and not anywhere they typically conducted business, to hand off the materials and plan their next move. After ending the call, Keahi sat in his patrol vehicle and watched the sky beginning to lighten with the approaching dawn. He'd joined the sheriff's department because he believed in the mission of protecting his community and upholding the law. The idea that someone in the department might be actively undermining that mission for personal gain was almost physically painful to contemplate. But if it was true, and the evidence Kapena had compiled certainly suggested it was, then exposing it was exactly the kind of duty he'd sworn to perform when he'd taken his oath of office. The final hours of his shift passed in a blur of routine calls and paperwork. He responded to a disabled vehicle, conducted a traffic stop for a broken taillight, and assisted with a minor accident where nobody was injured, but the drivers couldn't agree on who was at fault. Normal police work, the kind of thing that filled 95% of any patrol officer's time. But his mind was elsewhere, thinking about patterns of corruption and criminal enterprises, and the thin line between the people who were supposed to enforce the law and the people who found ways to profit from breaking it. When his shift ended at 8 a.m., Keahi drove home but didn't go to sleep despite his exhaustion. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table with a notebook and began writing out everything he knew about the case from beginning to end. The initial observation at K Point, the homicide victim on the beach, the pattern of distress calls and radar contacts, the intercepted operation at the second beach, and now Kapena's discovery of correlations that suggested long-term criminal enterprise protected by inside information. Seeing it all laid out in chronological order made the scope of the problem even more apparent. They weren't dealing with a smuggling crew that got lucky for a while. They were dealing with an organization that had systematically infiltrated law enforcement oversight and was using that access to operate with impunity. 3 days later, Keahi and Harbor Warden Kapena Kiawi sat in a small office in the district attorney's building, presenting their findings to a senior prosecutor who specialized in corruption cases. The prosecutor listened carefully, asked pointed questions about evidence and methodology, and reviewed the documentation Kapena had prepared. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, the prosecutor leaned back in her chair and stated what Keahi had been dreading to hear. The evidence was compelling but circumstantial. Without direct proof of who was providing information to the criminal organization, and without cooperation from someone inside that organization willing to testify, building a prosecutable corruption case would be extremely difficult. However, the prosecutor continued, there were other approaches they could take. Federal authorities had jurisdiction over maritime smuggling and counterfeit goods trafficking, and they had investigative resources that far exceeded what the county could bring to bear. If the case could be referred to federal prosecution, it might be possible to leverage the broader tools available at that level, including wiretaps, financial surveillance, and witness protection programs that could encourage cooperation from lower-level participants. The prosecutor stated she'd reach out to her counterparts in the U.S. Attorney's Office and see if there was interest in taking over the investigation. Keahi left that meeting with mixed feelings. On one hand, involving federal authorities meant the case would be taken seriously and would have the resources needed for a thorough investigation. On the other hand, it also meant losing local control over the case and potentially seeing it disappear into a federal bureaucracy where outcomes might take years to materialize. But he also recognized that this was probably the best available option, given the complexity of what they were dealing with. Some cases were simply too big for local law enforcement to handle alone, and having the humility to recognize that and ask for help was part of being a good officer. 2 weeks later, Keahi received a call from the senior prosecutor. She informed him that the federal authorities had agreed to open a formal investigation into the maritime smuggling operation and the potential corruption angle. They'd be sending a team of investigators to Hawaii within the month to begin interviews and evidence review. In the meantime, the 3 suspects arrested during the beach interdiction had been released on bail. The counterfeit electronics had been transferred to federal custody, and the boat had been seized under federal asset forfeiture laws pending the outcome of the investigation. Keahi thanked her for the update and asked if there was anything specific he should or shouldn't be doing while the federal investigation was underway. The prosecutor's advice was simple: continue doing his job, maintain normal patrol patterns, and document anything suspicious, but don't take action that might interfere with the federal investigation. If he observed what he thought might be criminal activity related to the smuggling case, he should report it through secure channels directly to the federal team rather than through the department's normal chain of command. The implication was clear: trust nobody in the department until the corruption angle had been fully investigated. The months that followed were frustrating in their normalcy. Keahi returned to routine patrol work, and the smuggling case receded into the background as other investigations and incidents demanded attention. Occasionally, he'd hear rumors about the federal investigation, usually third or fourth-hand information that was probably more speculation than fact. The large, unidentified vessel hadn't been detected in Hawaiian waters since the night of the interdiction, suggesting it had either changed its operational area or had been warned off permanently by whatever sources of information it relied on. 6 months after the beach interdiction, Keahi was called to a meeting at the federal building in Honolulu. He made the drive expecting to be interviewed about his observations and actions during the original case. Instead, he found himself in a conference room with 3 federal agents who wanted to show him something. They pulled up a series of photographs on a large monitor. Images of a commercial freighter being boarded by Coast Guard personnel in international waters about 800 miles west of Hawaii. The vessel matched the general description of the unidentified contact from the radar data, and a search of the vessel had revealed sophisticated communication equipment, falsified registration documents, and evidence of recent cargo operations. But the vessel itself was empty of contraband, and the crew consisted of licensed merchant mariners who all had plausible explanations for their presence on the vessel and their activities. Without catching them in the act of smuggling, and without cooperation from crew members, the federal agents explained, there wasn't enough evidence to make arrests stick. The vessel had been impounded pending further investigation, but unless additional evidence emerged, it would likely be released and the crew would walk away clean. The lead federal agent then showed Keahi one more photograph, This one, taken from the vessel's communication logs, which had been only partially erased before the Coast Guard boarded. It showed a series of encrypted transmissions sent to and from a number that had been traced back to a cell phone registered to someone in the Hawaiian Sheriff's Department. Not someone currently employed, the agent clarified, but someone who had retired about 4 months ago, right around the time the federal investigation became public knowledge within law enforcement circles. That person was now being sought for questioning, but had apparently left Hawaii and their current whereabouts were unknown. Keahi asked if they knew who it was, if it was someone he would have worked with or known during his time investigating the case. The agent hesitated, then stated that it wouldn't be appropriate to share that information while the investigation was ongoing. But the look on the agent's face told Keahi everything he needed to know. It was someone he knew, possibly someone he'd trusted, and the betrayal was going to hurt when the name finally became public. The agent thanked Keahi for his work on the case and stated that while the investigation hadn't resulted in the arrests and prosecutions they'd hoped for, it had successfully disrupted a significant criminal operation and had exposed corruption that could now be addressed. As Keahi drove back to his district station, he found himself thinking about the nature of victory in law enforcement. Sometimes you got the dramatic arrests, the successful prosecutions, the public recognition for taking dangerous criminals off the streets. Other times, you did everything right and still watched the case dissolve into technicalities, bureaucratic complications, and compromises that left nobody satisfied. The smuggling operation had been disrupted, but not destroyed. The corruption had been exposed, but the corrupt individual had escaped before facing consequences. The cargo had been seized, but the people organizing and profiting from the enterprise had remained free. But the beaches where those operations had occurred were quiet now. The pattern of suspicious distress calls and radar contacts had stopped. Whatever criminal enterprise had been operating in the waters off Oahu had either shut down or moved to a different area where they'd eventually attract the attention of different law enforcement agencies and go through this entire cycle again. And Keahi would return to his patrol routes, responding to calls and conducting traffic stops, and occasionally stumbling across evidence of crimes that were bigger than they initially appeared. That night, during his shift, Keahi drove past Kahe Point and looked out at the dark ocean beyond the shore. Somewhere out there, perhaps hundreds or thousands of miles away, a vessel was operating under falsified documents, with a crew that knew how to exploit the seams between different jurisdictions and different agencies. They'd been disrupted, but not caught, and they'd learned lessons from this encounter that would make them harder to detect next time. And next time they might be someone else's problem, or they might be back in these waters after enough time had passed for vigilance to fade, and for new vulnerabilities to emerge in the system designed to stop them. Keahi's radio crackled with dispatcher Nalani Maho's voice, dispatching him to a disabled vehicle on the highway. He acknowledged and turned away from the ocean, returning to the immediate demands of his job. The smuggling case would remain open in federal files somewhere, one of hundreds or thousands of investigations that consumed resources and produced incomplete outcomes. But for now, there were other calls to answer, other people who needed help, and other ways to serve the mission he'd sworn to uphold when he'd taken his badge. Some cases ended with clarity and closure. Others ended with questions that might never be answered and with the uncomfortable knowledge that the people you'd been chasing were still out there somewhere, making new plans and looking for new opportunities. The job was to keep showing up, keep watching, and keep trusting that eventually the accumulated weight of small victories would matter more than the individual frustrations of cases that didn't resolve cleanly. The ocean would keep its secrets for now. The volcanic fog came down thick that afternoon. the kind of weather that made the saddle road between Hilo and Kona feel like driving through a cloud that had decided to settle on the ground and stay there. Deputy Kaimana Kahili had worked this stretch of the Big Island for 3 years now, long enough to know that when the fog rolled in off Kilauea and mixed with the rain clouds that built up over Mauna Kea, visibility could drop to almost nothing in minutes. He was driving slowly, flashers on, when the call came through from his lieutenant. There was an abandoned vehicle reported about 8 miles ahead, sitting on the shoulder near mile marker 43, and could he check it out when he reached that location? Kaimana acknowledged the call and continued driving, his headlights barely penetrating the gray soup that surrounded his patrol vehicle. The saddle road wasn't technically his primary patrol area, but the department was stretched thin today with 2 deputies out sick and another tied up with a domestic situation in Hilo that had been going on for hours. Lieutenant Nohea Kapuli had asked him to cover this sector as a favor. Just drive through once or twice and make sure nobody was stranded or in trouble on what was essentially a lonely highway cutting through volcanic terrain between the 2 massive mountains that dominated the island. Most days it was an easy assignment, maybe help a tourist with a flat tire, or check on someone pulled over to take photos of the landscape. But something about today felt different, and Kaimana couldn't quite put his finger on why. He found the abandoned vehicle exactly where dispatch had said it would be. A white sedan with rental company markings pulled onto the narrow shoulder with its hazard lights still blinking weakly. The fog was so thick here that Kaimana almost missed it, only spotting the vehicle when he was within 20 feet of its rear bumper. He pulled in behind it and activated his own emergency lights, then sat for a moment observing the scene before getting out. The sedan appeared empty from what he could see, windows slightly fogged from the interior but no visible occupants. The driver's door was closed but not fully latched, hanging open just enough that the interior dome light was trying to stay on and draining what was left of the battery. Kaimana radioed his position to dispatch and confirmed he was investigating the abandoned vehicle. Then he stepped out into the cold dampness of the volcanic fog, immediately feeling the chill through his uniform shirt despite the fact that it was technically summer. The temperature at this elevation was always 15 or 20 degrees cooler than down on the coast, and the moisture in the air made it feel even colder. He approached the sedan carefully, one hand resting on his service weapon out of habit, though nothing about the scene suggested immediate danger. Just an empty rental car on a foggy road, probably some tourist who'd gotten spooked by the weather and called for a ride rather than continuing to drive in these conditions. But when he looked inside the vehicle, things started feeling wrong. The keys were still in the ignition, turned to the off position but not removed. A woman's purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet visible inside, and what looked like a passport or similar document tucked into the side pocket. The rental agreement was in the center console, made out to someone named Sarah with a Honolulu address, and on the back seat was a small roller suitcase, unzipped, and with clothing visible inside like someone had been searching through it. None of that made sense for someone who'd simply abandoned their vehicle because of bad weather. People didn't leave their identification and money behind unless something had forced them to leave in a hurry. Kaimana opened the driver's door fully and checked the registration and rental paperwork more carefully. The vehicle had been rented 3 days ago from the Kona airport, due back tomorrow. The contract showed the renter as a mainland tourist, and the emergency contact number listed a California area code. He photographed the documents with his phone and then began searching the immediate area around the vehicle, looking for any sign of where the driver might have gone or what might have caused them to abandon the car so abruptly. The shoulder here was barely wide enough for a vehicle, with rough volcanic rock dropping away steeply on the ocean side and rising up toward the mountain on the other side. After circling the vehicle twice and finding nothing obvious, Kaimana returned to his patrol car and radioed a more detailed report to dispatch. He described the abandoned rental, the personal belongings left inside, and his assessment that this didn't appear to be a simple breakdown or weather-related abandonment. Dispatch acknowledged and stated they'd try calling the emergency contact number from the rental agreement to see if they could reach the vehicle's renter or someone who knew their plans. In the meantime, dispatch asked if Kaimana wanted them to contact Park Ranger Mahina Mahalona, who worked the Mauna Kea access roads and might have seen something relevant while doing her rounds earlier in the day. Kaimana confirmed that would be helpful, then made a decision to wait with the vehicle rather than continuing his patrol. Something about this situation was triggering his instincts, the same feeling he got when a routine call was about to turn into something more serious. He'd learned to trust that feeling over his years on the job, and right now it was telling him that whoever had been driving this rental car hadn't left voluntarily and might be in trouble somewhere nearby. The fog was actually getting thicker, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet in any direction, which meant if someone was injured or lost in this area, finding them was going to be extremely difficult. About 10 minutes later, Park Ranger Mahina Mahalona pulled up in her distinctive green National Park Service vehicle, emerging from the fog like a ghost materializing out of the mist. Mahina was a veteran ranger who'd worked the Big Island for over a decade, and she knew the terrain around both Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa better than almost anyone. She walked over to Kaimana's patrol car, and he filled her in on what he'd found. Mahina listened carefully, then walked over to examine the rental car herself, taking her time to look at details that Kaimana had already documented. When she came back, her expression was troubled. She stated that she'd driven this section of road about 3 hours ago during her regular patrol, and she was almost certain this vehicle hadn't been here at that time. She'd been specifically watching the shoulders because of the fog conditions, making sure nobody was stranded or in distress, and she would have noticed a white sedan with its flashers on. That meant the vehicle had been abandoned within the last 3 hours, which narrowed the timeline significantly. More importantly, Mahina added, there was something odd about where the vehicle was positioned. The shoulder here wasn't a natural place to pull over because it was too narrow, and the drop-off was too steep. If someone had engine trouble or needed to stop for weather, there were better spots within a quarter-mile in either direction where pulling over would be safer. Kaimana asked what she thought that meant. Mahina hesitated, then said that in her experience, when vehicles ended up in awkward locations like this, it usually meant the driver had been forced to stop suddenly rather than choosing to pull over. Either a mechanical failure that didn't give them time to reach a better spot, or something else that had happened quickly and unexpectedly. She suggested they expand their search of the immediate area, particularly checking whether there were any signs of someone having climbed up or down the rocky terrain on either side of the road. In fog this thick, it would be easy for someone to become disoriented and wander away from the road, especially if they were already upset or panicked about whatever had caused them to stop. They split up, with Mahina checking the uphill side and Kaimana taking the downhill side toward the ocean. The volcanic rock here was rough and unstable, the kind of terrain that could twist an ankle or cause a serious fall if you weren't careful about where you stepped. Kaimana moved slowly, calling out occasionally in case someone was within earshot but unable to respond loudly. The fog swallowed his voice almost immediately, making it feel like he was shouting into a void that absorbed sound and gave nothing back. After about 20 minutes of careful searching, he'd covered maybe 100 yards along the shoulder and found nothing but rock and scrub vegetation. He was about to radio Mahina and suggest they expand the search pattern when his phone rang. It was Lieutenant Nohea Kapule, calling rather than using the radio, which usually meant she wanted to discuss something that shouldn't be broadcast where anyone with a scanner could hear it. Kaimana answered and the lieutenant got straight to the point. Dispatch had managed to reach the emergency contact number from the rental agreement, and they'd spoken with the renter's sister on the mainland. According to the sister, the renter was a woman named Sarah who'd come to Hawaii specifically for medical treatment, something experimental that apparently wasn't available or approved on the mainland. The sister was frantic, stating that Sarah had a serious medical condition and needed regular medication, and if she'd been away from her medication for more than a few hours, she could be in real danger. Kaimana felt his chest tighten. This had just escalated from a suspicious abandoned vehicle to a potential medical emergency involving someone who might be critically ill and lost in terrain where finding them would be difficult, even in good conditions. He asked Lieutenant Kapule if the sister knew what kind of medical condition they were dealing with. The lieutenant stated the sister had been vague about specifics, which she'd found odd, but had emphasized that time was critical, and that Sarah absolutely needed to be found as quickly as possible. The lieutenant was coordinating with the fire department to get a search and rescue team mobilized, but given the weather and terrain, it would take at least an hour to get personnel and equipment in position. After ending the call, Kaimana walked back to where Park Ranger Mahina Mahalona was still searching the uphill side of the road. He filled her in on what the lieutenant had said, and Mahina's expression went from troubled to seriously concerned. She stated that medical emergencies in this kind of environment were the worst-case scenario because, even if they found the person quickly, getting them to proper medical care could take hours, given the distances involved and the limited helicopter operations in this weather. She pulled out a topographic map and spread it on the hood of her vehicle, using her finger to trace possible routes someone might have taken if they'd left the road on foot. The problem, Mahina explained, was that the terrain here didn't really lead anywhere useful. Uphill would take you toward the Mauna Kea access road eventually, but it was steep and dangerous climbing with no clear trail. Downhill toward the ocean was even worse. All volcanic rock and cinder fields that could extend for miles before you hit anything resembling a road or structure. If Sarah had left the road intentionally, it suggested she'd been trying to reach something specific, maybe a meeting point or a location she'd been given directions to. If she'd left the road because she was disoriented or medically compromised, she could be anywhere within a very large search radius. Kaimana made a decision. They needed to expand the search immediately, not wait for the formal search and rescue team to arrive. He radioed Lieutenant Kapule and requested additional units if any were available, emphasizing that this was now a critical medical situation. The lieutenant acknowledged and stated she'd pull deputies from other areas if necessary, but it would still take time for them to reach this remote location. In the meantime, Kaimana and Mahina should do what they could with the understanding that officer safety was the priority, and they shouldn't take risks that could result in additional people needing rescue. Just as Kaimana was about to resume searching, he noticed something he'd missed during his first examination of the rental car. There was a small piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper on the driver's side, protected from the moisture by being folded and wedged tightly into place. He carefully extracted it and unfolded it, finding what appeared to be a receipt from a medical supply company in Hilo, dated yesterday. The receipt listed several items that Kaimana didn't immediately recognize, but the quantities and prices suggested someone purchasing supplies for home medical care rather than just over-the-counter medications. At the bottom of the receipt, someone had written in pen a phone number with a note that said, "Delivery confirmation required." He photographed the receipt and then called the phone number, not sure what to expect. The call went straight to voicemail, a generic automated message that didn't identify who or what organization the number belonged to. Kaimana left a brief message identifying himself as County Sheriff's Deputy and stating he needed to speak with someone about a medical supply delivery related to an emergency situation. Then provided his callback number. It was a long shot, but sometimes long shots paid off, especially when you were dealing with situations that didn't make sense through conventional investigation. Park Ranger Mahina Mahalona had been watching this process, and when Kaimana ended the call, she asked what he thought the receipt meant. He admitted he wasn't sure, but the reference to delivery confirmation suggested that Sarah might have been expecting to receive medical supplies at a specific location, possibly somewhere other than a hotel or conventional address. If she'd been seeking experimental treatment that wasn't officially available in Hawaii, that treatment might have been happening in an unofficial location, maybe a private residence or a facility that operated outside normal medical licensing. That would explain why she'd been driving on the Saddle Road, which wasn't the route between any major medical facilities on the island. Before they could discuss it further, Kaimana's phone rang again. It was a number he didn't recognize, a local area code, but not one stored in his contacts. He answered and found himself speaking with someone who identified themselves as being associated with a medical research program on the Big Island. The person said they'd received his voicemail and wanted to clarify some things before providing information. Kaimana stated he was investigating an abandoned vehicle and a missing person who might be medically at risk, and he needed any information that could help locate them. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then the person asked specifically what name was on the rental agreement. Kaimana provided Sarah's name from the rental documents, and immediately the tone of the conversation shifted. The person on the phone asked for Kaimana's exact location, then stated they were sending someone to meet him at that location within the next 30 minutes. When Kaimana pressed for more information about what was going on, the person became evasive, stating only that this was a sensitive situation involving confidential medical information, and that someone with proper authority would explain everything when they arrived. The call ended before Kaimana could ask any follow-up questions, leaving him standing in the fog with more questions than answers about what he'd stumbled into. He updated Park Ranger Mahina Mahalona on the strange phone conversation, and her expression suggested she was just as confused as he was. She stated that in all her years working this area, she'd never heard of any medical research program operating out here, and if there was one, it was doing a very good job of staying under the radar. The Big Island had legitimate medical facilities in Hilo and Kona, and various small clinics scattered around the island, but nothing she was aware of that would describe itself as research-focused, or that would be connected to someone receiving experimental treatment. While they waited for whoever was supposedly coming to meet them, Kaimana and Mahina continued their search of the area around the abandoned rental car. The fog was starting to lift slightly, improving visibility to maybe 100 feet, which made searching somewhat easier, but still far from ideal. They'd expanded their search radius to about 200 yards in each direction when Mahina called out that she'd found something. Kaimana carefully made his way across the rocky terrain to where she was standing, and she pointed to what appeared to be a piece of torn fabric caught on a jagged rock about 50 feet downhill from the road. The fabric was light blue, possibly from a jacket or shirt, and appeared to have been torn recently based on the clean edges of the tear. More significantly, there were scuff marks in the volcanic soil near where the fabric was found, suggesting someone had slipped or fallen in this area. Mahina photographed the evidence and then carefully began following what might have been a trail, looking for additional signs of someone having passed through this terrain. Kaimana followed, radio in hand in case they needed to call for immediate assistance if they found Sarah injured somewhere in this rocky maze. They'd gone maybe another 100 feet when they found the second piece of evidence. A cell phone lying face down among the rocks, its screen shattered but the device itself still intact. Kaimana carefully picked it up using a glove to avoid contaminating any potential evidence and tried the power button. The phone was dead, either from the impact of being dropped or from the battery running out. He bagged it as evidence, knowing that even if the screen was destroyed, the phone's internal storage might contain information about what Sarah had been doing and where she'd been trying to go when she abandoned her vehicle. They were about to continue following the trail when Kaimana heard a vehicle approaching from the direction of Kona. He climbed back up to the road level and saw a dark SUV with no official markings pulling to a stop behind his patrol car. Two people emerged from the vehicle, both wearing casual clothing rather than any kind of uniform or official identification. The driver approached Kaimana and introduced himself simply as someone associated with the medical program that Sarah had been participating in. He didn't provide a name or show any credentials, which immediately raised Kaimana's suspicions about who these people were and what authority they thought they had to be involved in this situation. Kaimana stated clearly that this was an active missing person investigation involving a potentially endangered individual, and he needed proper identification and explanation of these people's connection to the case before discussing anything further. The driver seemed to expect this response, and after a moment of hesitation, pulled out a wallet and showed what appeared to be federal identification. Though the agency name was partially obscured, and Kaimana couldn't read it clearly in the dim light and fog. The driver stated that Sarah had been participating in an experimental treatment protocol that was being conducted under special authorization, and that her disappearance represented not just a personal emergency, but potentially a serious breach of the protocol's security requirements. Before Kaimana could respond to that concerning statement, his radio crackled with Lieutenant Nohia Kapule's voice. She stated that she was en route to his location and should arrive within 15 minutes, and that she'd been contacted by federal authorities who claimed jurisdiction over some aspects of this case. She asked if the people from the medical program had arrived yet, and when Kaimana confirmed they had, she instructed him not to share any evidence or information with them until she got there and could sort out the jurisdictional questions. The tone of her voice made it clear she was just as confused and concerned about this situation as Kaimana was. The person with the federal identification seemed to expect this as well, and stated he was willing to wait for the lieutenant to arrive before discussing details. But he also emphasized that time was critical, and that if Sarah had been away from her treatment protocol for more than a few hours, there could be serious consequences that went beyond just her personal medical situation. He wouldn't elaborate on what those consequences might be, which only deepened the sense that this case involved something significantly more complicated than a tourist with a medical condition getting lost in the fog. Park Ranger Mahina Mahalona had climbed back up to the road and was observing this interaction with obvious skepticism. She quietly asked Kaimana if he wanted her to continue searching while they waited for the lieutenant, or if she should stay here in case the situation required an additional official presence. Kaimana thought about it and decided that finding Sarah was still the priority regardless of whatever jurisdictional complications were emerging. So he asked Mahina to continue following the trail they'd found while he dealt with the federal people and waited for Lieutenant Kapule to arrive. As Mahina headed back down into the rocky terrain, Kaimana positioned himself between his patrol car and the federal SUV, making it clear through his body language that he was maintaining control of this scene until his supervisor arrived and decided otherwise. The two federal people seemed content to wait, though they kept glancing at their watches and occasionally speaking quietly to each other in tones too low for Kaimana to hear. Whatever was going on here, it was clear these people knew more than they were saying, and their priority seemed to be protecting some kind of official secret, rather than helping find a missing person who might be in medical danger. The wait felt longer than 15 minutes, but eventually Lieutenant Nohea Kapule's vehicle emerged from the fog, pulling in behind the growing line of parked cars on the narrow shoulder. The lieutenant was a 20-year veteran of the department, someone who'd worked her way up through the ranks and who had a reputation for not tolerating bureaucratic games when public safety was at stake. She approached the scene with her badge clearly visible and immediately asked the federal people to show their credentials and explain their presence at what was currently a county sheriff's investigation. The driver produced his identification again, this time allowing the lieutenant to examine it more closely. Whatever she saw apparently satisfied her that these were legitimate federal agents of some kind, because her posture relaxed slightly, though her expression remained skeptical. She asked directly what federal interest there was in a missing tourist with a medical condition, and why federal agents were showing up at a remote location on the Big Island faster than they could possibly have responded from Honolulu unless they'd already been nearby and monitoring the situation. The federal agent who'd shown his credentials to Lieutenant Nohea Kapule seemed to make a calculation about how much he could safely reveal. He stated that Sarah had been participating in a clinical trial for an experimental treatment that was being conducted under a special authorization framework that allowed certain procedures to be performed outside the normal FDA approval process. The treatment involved regular injections and monitoring, and the trial protocol required participants to maintain strict schedules for receiving their doses. Sarah had missed her scheduled appointment that morning, which had triggered concern from the medical team, and when they'd been unable to reach her by phone, they'd started trying to locate her through other means. Lieutenant Kapule asked why a missed medical appointment would bring federal agents to a remote highway rather than simply contacting local hospitals or law enforcement through normal channels. The agent hesitated again, then stated that the nature of the treatment created certain obligations regarding participant safety and protocol security. He couldn't elaborate further without violating confidentiality agreements, but he emphasized that finding Sarah quickly was absolutely critical, and that the county sheriff's department should consider this a matter requiring immediate search and rescue resources at the highest priority level. Deputy Kaimana Kahele had been listening to this exchange while keeping one eye on the terrain where Park Ranger Mahina Mahalona had gone to continue tracking the trail. Something about the agent's explanation didn't sit right with him. Clinical trials happened all the time, and while they involved paperwork and protocols, they didn't usually bring federal agents scrambling to remote locations when a participant went missing. The level of urgency these people were displaying suggested they weren't just worried about Sarah's medical condition. They were worried about something else, something they weren't willing to explain to local law enforcement. Before Lieutenant Kapule could press the issue further, Mahina's voice came over Kaimana's radio. She stated she'd followed the trail for approximately a quarter mile through increasingly rough terrain, and she'd found what appeared to be a small shelter or structure built into a natural depression in the volcanic rock. The structure was partially concealed by the terrain and wouldn't be visible from the road or from the air, and it appeared to have been deliberately camouflaged with materials that blended into the surrounding environment. She was approaching it now, but wanted backup before investigating further, as she had no idea if anyone was inside or what the situation might be. Kaimana immediately relayed this information to Lieutenant Kapule, and the lieutenant made a quick decision. She directed Kaimana to join Mahina at the structure's location and assess the situation, while she remained with the federal agents to prevent them from interfering with the investigation until they had a better understanding of what was happening. The federal agents immediately protested, stating they needed to be present if Sarah was found because of the medical protocols involved, but the lieutenant shut that down firmly. This was a county investigation on county land, and federal personnel would remain where they were until she decided otherwise. Kaimana grabbed his emergency medical kit from his patrol vehicle and began carefully making his way down the slope, following the path that Mahina had marked with small rock cairns to make it easier to retrace. The terrain was treacherous, all loose volcanic rock and hidden crevices that could twist an ankle or worse if you weren't careful where you stepped. The fog was continuing to lift but was being replaced by a light rain, the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything slippery and reduced visibility almost as effectively as the fog had. It took him almost 10 minutes to cover the quarter mile to where Mahina was waiting. The structure she'd found was exactly as she'd described, a small shelter built into a natural bowl in the volcanic rock, with walls constructed from local materials and a roof made from what appeared to be industrial tarps covered with rocks and vegetation for camouflage. It looked like the kind of thing someone might build for temporary shelter, except that the construction quality suggested it had been here for a while and had been maintained. There was no visible door, just an opening that had been covered with a tarp that could be pulled aside. Mahina had positioned herself where she could observe the entrance without being directly in front of it, standard tactical positioning for approaching an unknown structure. Kaimana called out, identifying himself as county sheriff's deputy and stating they were looking for Sarah, who might need medical assistance. No response came from inside the shelter, just the sound of rain hitting the tarp and the distant rumble of thunder from the storm system that was moving across the island. He called out again, this time louder, emphasizing that they were there to help and that if someone was inside and needed assistance, they should make some kind of sound or signal. Still nothing, which left them with the decision of whether to enter the structure without knowing what they might find inside. Lieutenant Kapul's voice came over the radio, asking for a status update. Kaimana reported their location and the situation with the shelter, and asked for guidance on how to proceed. The lieutenant stated she was going to start heading down to their position herself, but in the meantime, they had exigent circumstances based on the medical emergency aspect of the case, which justified entering the structure to search for someone who might be injured or incapacitated inside. She reminded them to be careful and to document everything they saw, because, depending on what they found, this could become a complex legal situation very quickly. Mahina pulled out her flashlight and nodded to Kaimana, indicating she was ready to proceed. Kaimana drew his service weapon, not because he expected a threat, but because basic officer safety protocols required it when entering an unknown structure. He used his free hand to pull aside the tarp covering the entrance, and Mahina immediately swept the interior with her flashlight beam. What the light revealed made both of them freeze for a moment, as they processed what they were seeing. The shelter's interior was much larger than the exterior suggested, extending back into what must have been a natural lava tube or cave that had been modified and expanded. The front section had been set up as a living space with a cot, some storage containers, and a small camping stove. But the back section was something else entirely. There were metal shelving units holding what appeared to be medical equipment, including IV stands, monitoring devices, and a small refrigeration unit running off a portable generator. On one of the shelves were rows of vials containing clear liquid, each carefully labeled with dates and codes that meant nothing to Kaimana. And lying on the cot in the front section, partially covered by a blanket, was a woman who matched the description of Sarah from the rental car documents. Kaimana holstered his weapon and immediately went to check on Sarah, while Mahina covered him and scanned the rest of the space for any threats. Sarah was breathing, but unconscious, her skin pale and cool to the touch. Her pulse was weak but steady, and there were no obvious signs of trauma or injury. What Kaimana did notice were recent injection sites on her arms, multiple small puncture marks that suggested she'd been receiving regular injections of something. Next to the cot was a small medical waste container holding used syringes and empty vials, and a handwritten log that appeared to track injection times and dosages. He immediately radioed Lieutenant Kapule with an update. They'd found Sarah. She was alive but unconscious, and they needed medical evacuation as soon as possible. He also reported that the shelter appeared to be some kind of unauthorized medical facility, and that there was evidence suggesting Sarah had been self-administering some kind of treatment here. The lieutenant acknowledged and stated she was calling for a helicopter evacuation immediately, though the weather might complicate that. In the meantime, she was sending the federal agents down to their location because they might have information about Sarah's medical condition that would be relevant for the paramedics. While they waited, Kaimana began documenting the scene with his phone camera, photographing the medical equipment, the vials, the logbook, and the general layout of the shelter. Mahina was examining the refrigeration unit more closely, and she pointed out that the vials were being kept at a very specific temperature according to the digital display on the unit. Whatever Sarah had been injecting herself with, it required careful storage, which suggested it was probably some kind of biological medication that would degrade if not kept under proper conditions. That level of sophistication went well beyond someone self-medicating with prescription drugs obtained through questionable means. The federal agents arrived about 10 minutes later, slightly out of breath from the difficult climb down from the road. The lead agent took one look at the shelter's interior, and his expression shifted from concerned to something that looked almost like resignation. He stated flatly that this was exactly what he'd been afraid they'd find, and that the situation was now significantly more complicated than a simple missing person case. When Lieutenant Capulet, who'd arrived right behind the agents, demanded an explanation of what that meant, the agent asked if they could have this conversation somewhere other than inside the shelter, preferably back up at the road where they could speak privately. Kaimana volunteered to stay with Sarah and monitor her condition until the evacuation helicopter arrived, which would take at least 30 minutes given the weather and the need to find a safe landing zone near this location. Lieutenant Kapula agreed and directed Park Ranger Mahina Mahalona to assist Kaimana while she went back up to the road with the federal agents to get answers about what they'd stumbled into. Before leaving, the lieutenant pulled Kaimana aside and told him quietly to photograph everything in that shelter, every label on every vial, every page of that logbook, and every piece of equipment. Whatever was happening here, she wanted their own documentation in case the federal people tried to classify or restrict information later. After the lieutenant and the agents left, Kaimana did exactly that, methodically photographing every detail of the shelter while Mahina stayed with Sarah and monitored her vital signs. Sarah's breathing had become slightly more regular, and her skin color was improving, suggesting that whatever had caused her unconsciousness wasn't immediately life-threatening. But she still wasn't waking up, which concerned both of them. Mahina, who had wilderness first responder training through her work as a park ranger, stated that Sarah's symptoms were consistent with either medication overdose or some kind of adverse reaction to whatever she'd been injecting. While examining the logbook more closely, Kaimana noticed something disturbing. The entries went back almost 3 months, with injections recorded every 3 to 4 days like clockwork, but the handwriting changed about halfway through the log. The early entries were neat and precise, while the later entries became increasingly shaky and erratic, with some dates circled and notations in the margins that included things like increased tremors and vision issues and difficulty concentrating. Whatever Sarah had been doing to herself, it appeared to be causing progressive neurological symptoms that she'd been documenting, but not stopping. Even more troubling were the entries from the past week. The intervals between injections had decreased, with doses being administered daily rather than every few days, and the dosage amounts had been increased according to the numbers recorded. The final entry was from this morning, just a few hours before Sarah had abandoned her rental car on the highway. The entry was barely legible, but Kaimana could make out the words "severe reaction" and "need help" before the writing devolved into illegible scrawls. Whatever had happened, Sarah had apparently known she was in trouble and had been trying to get help, but something had prevented her from completing that journey. The sound of rotor blades announced the arrival of the medical helicopter, and Kaimana could hear it circling above, trying to find a safe place to land in the difficult terrain and weather. The pilot's voice came over his radio, stating they'd identified a relatively flat area about 200 yards from the shelter's location where they could set down briefly, but the weather was marginal and they'd need to make this quick. Kaimana acknowledged and began preparing to move Sarah, working with Mahina to secure her in a way that would allow them to carry her across the rough terrain to the landing zone. They were in the process of carefully lifting Sarah when her eyes suddenly opened. She looked around in confusion and panic, trying to sit up and push them away. Kaimana immediately identified himself and Mahina, explaining they were law enforcement and park service and that they were getting her medical help. But Sarah's response was unexpected and alarming. She grabbed Kaimana's arm with surprising strength and said, clearly despite her obvious distress, that she couldn't go to a regular hospital, that they didn't understand what she'd been taking, and if they tried to treat her conventionally, it could kill her. She needed to speak with someone from the program, someone who understood the protocol. Kaimana tried to calm her down, stating that the federal agents from her program were here and would meet her at the hospital, but Sarah shook her head violently. She insisted that she needed to speak with them now before she was moved, because there were things she needed to tell someone before her memory got worse. She struggled to reach into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small thumb drive, pressing it into Kaimana's hand. She said the drive contained documentation about the treatment program, about what she'd discovered about the protocol, and about why she thought the program wasn't what she'd been told it was. She made him promise to get the drive to someone in law enforcement who wasn't connected to the federal program, someone who could investigate independently. Before Kaimana could ask what she meant by that, Sarah's eyes rolled back and she lost consciousness again. Mahina checked her pulse and confirmed it was still present but weakening, and stated they needed to get her to the helicopter immediately. They resumed their careful movement across the terrain, with Kaimana pocketing the thumb drive and making a mental note to tell Lieutenant Kapoor about it as soon as they reached the landing zone. Whatever Sarah had been trying to say, it suggested the experimental treatment program wasn't as legitimate or benign as the federal agents had implied. The helicopter crew met them halfway with a litter, and within minutes they had Sarah loaded and were lifting off into the rain-soaked sky. The pilot confirmed they were heading to the hospital in Hilo, and that he'd radioed ahead to have emergency room staff prepared for a patient with unknown medication complications. Kaimana watched the helicopter disappear into the clouds, then turned to Mahina and showed her the thumb drive Sarah had given him. Mahina's expression was grim as she stated they needed to get that to Lieutenant Kapule immediately, before the federal agents asked if Sarah had said anything or given them anything. They made their way back up to the road, arriving muddy and exhausted to find Lieutenant Kapule in what appeared to be a heated discussion with the lead federal agent. The lieutenant saw them approaching and broke away from the conversation, walking over to meet them away from the agents. Kaimana quietly explained what Sarah had said and handed over the thumb drive. The lieutenant examined it for a moment, then tucked it into her pocket and stated they'd be taking it to the department's tech specialist to see what was on it before anyone else knew it existed. The federal agent tried to approach and ask if Sarah had regained consciousness or said anything, but Lieutenant Kapule cut him off and stated that Sarah had been unconscious throughout the evacuation and they had nothing to report at this time. The agent didn't look convinced, but he also couldn't prove otherwise. So he accepted the statement and stated his team would be coordinating with the hospital to ensure Sarah received appropriate care for her specific medical situation. He also stated that the shelter and all its contents were now part of a federal investigation and would need to be secured and processed by federal personnel. Lieutenant Kapule responded that the shelter was located on state land and had been discovered during a county investigation, which meant it fell under state jurisdiction until a federal court order said otherwise. The agent started to argue, but the lieutenant shut it down, stating she wasn't going to debate jurisdiction on the side of a highway in the rain. If the federal government wanted to assert jurisdiction over the shelter, they could file the appropriate paperwork and she'd review it. Until then, the site was a crime scene under county control and would be processed accordingly. She directed Deputy Kaimana Kahele to remain at the location and secure the scene until evidence technicians could arrive to document and collect everything. The federal agents clearly weren't happy with this decision, but they also didn't have the legal authority to override it, at least not immediately. They got back in their SUV and left, presumably to contact their supervisors and start the process of asserting federal jurisdiction. As soon as they were gone, Lieutenant Kapule gathered Kaimana and Mahina together and spoke quietly. She stated that something about this whole situation felt wrong, and that she wanted them to be extremely careful about who they shared information with until they better understood what they were dealing with. She explained that during her conversation with the federal agents up at the road, they'd claimed the experimental treatment was a legitimate clinical trial approved through special authorization channels. But when she'd pressed for specific details about what agency had granted the authorization and what the treatment was designed to address, the agents had become vague and defensive. They'd cited patient privacy laws and national security considerations, which were standard bureaucratic deflections when federal agencies didn't want to answer questions. But in her experience, legitimate medical research programs were usually happy to explain what they were doing in general terms, even if they couldn't discuss specific patient details. Park Ranger Mahina Mahalona asked the obvious question: what did the lieutenant think was really going on? The lieutenant admitted she didn't know yet, but her working theory was that they were looking at either an unauthorized medical experiment that was being conducted outside proper oversight, or possibly a legitimate program that had gone wrong and was now trying to cover up problems. Either way, Sarah's warning about the program not being what she'd been told suggested there were serious ethical issues at play, and the thumb drive she'd handed over might contain evidence of those issues. The rain was getting heavier, making it clear that processing the shelter site was going to be miserable work, but it was necessary. Lieutenant Kapule called for additional units and evidence technicians, emphasizing this was a priority scene that needed to be documented before weather destroyed evidence or federal agents returned with court orders. She also contacted the department's legal advisor to get guidance on how to handle the jurisdictional dispute with the federal agents, because she fully expected them to return with more aggressive assertions of federal authority once they'd consulted with their supervisors. While they waited for backup to arrive, Kaimana walked Lieutenant Kapule through everything he and Mahina had observed in the shelter, including the medical equipment, the labeled vials, the logbook entries showing Sarah's deteriorating condition, and the evidence of self-injection over an extended period. The lieutenant photographed all of his photos using her phone, creating a backup of the documentation in case something happened to the original files. She also made Kaimana write out a detailed statement right then while events were fresh, wanting a contemporaneous record that could be used later if the case ended up in court. About 40 minutes later, evidence technicians arrived along with 2 additional deputies who would help secure the scene perimeter. Lieutenant Kapule directed them to document everything in the shelter before removing anything, and to pay particular attention to the vials and the refrigeration unit, since those might contain evidence of what substance Sarah had been injecting. She also instructed them to photograph all serial numbers on equipment, in case they needed to trace where the items had been purchased, or who had set up the facility. While the evidence team worked, Kaimana received a call on his cell phone from ER nurse Leilani Kalama at the Hilo Hospital. Leilani was a friend from high school who'd become a nurse, and she was calling because she'd been assigned to Sarah's case when she arrived. Leilani stated quietly that the federal agents had shown up at the hospital within minutes of Sarah's arrival, and had been trying to assert control over her treatment, even attempting to give the medical staff specific instructions about what medications to administer or avoid. The ER doctor had pushed back, stating that he wasn't taking medical orders from non-medical personnel, but the situation had gotten tense, and Leilani thought law enforcement should know that federal agents were interfering with patient care. Kaimana thanked her for the heads-up and immediately relayed this information to Lieutenant Kapule. The lieutenant's expression darkened as she processed this news. She stated this confirmed her suspicions that something was seriously wrong with this supposed clinical trial, because legitimate medical researchers didn't show up at emergency rooms trying to dictate treatment for study participants. That kind of behavior suggested people trying to control information or prevent medical staff from discovering something about what Sarah had been taking. The lieutenant made a decision. She directed one of the deputies to drive to the Hilo hospital immediately and take a position in the ER to observe the situation with Sarah and document any interactions between the federal agents and medical staff. She also called the hospital administrator directly to inform them that Sarah was part of an active criminal investigation and that no one, including federal agents, should be allowed to interfere with her medical care or remove her from the facility without explicit approval from the sheriff's department. The administrator sounded surprised, but agreed to the restrictions and stated hospital security would be briefed accordingly. As afternoon transitioned into evening, the weather continued to deteriorate, and the evidence processing at the shelter became a race against time. The technicians managed to document the scene and collect the key evidence, including all the vials from the refrigeration unit, the logbook, and samples from the used syringes in the medical waste container. Everything was carefully packaged and transported up to the road where it could be loaded into vehicles for transport to the evidence facility. Lieutenant Capulli personally took custody of the vials and the logbook, stating she wanted those items under direct chain of custody, given their potential significance. Once the scene was processed and secured, Kaimana was finally released from the location and told to head back to the station to complete his reports. The rain had soaked through his uniform and he was cold and exhausted, but his mind was still processing everything they'd discovered. He kept thinking about Sarah's warning, about the program not being what she'd been told, and about her insistence that trying to treat her conventionally could be dangerous. What kind of experimental treatment would create that kind of situation? Back at the station, Lieutenant Capulli called Kaimana into her office and closed the door. She stated that she'd had a chance to examine the thumb drive Sarah had given him, and what she'd found was disturbing enough that she'd decided to bypass normal channels and go straight to the state attorney general's office. The drive contained copies of consent forms, medical protocols, and email correspondence that Sarah had apparently been documenting over the past few months. According to the materials, the clinical trial she'd been participating in was testing a treatment for a degenerative neurological condition, but the consent forms contained language that essentially waived any liability for side effects and stated that participants understood they were receiving an experimental therapy that had not been tested for safety. More troubling were the email exchanges between Sarah and someone identified only as the program coordinator. In those exchanges, Sarah had been asking questions about side effects she was experiencing, particularly the tremors and vision problems documented in her logbook. The coordinator's responses had been dismissive, stating that minor side effects were expected and that discontinuing treatment would result in rapid progression of her underlying condition. But what really caught the lieutenant's attention was an email from 2 weeks ago where Sarah stated she'd done some research on the medication codes from the vials and couldn't find any record of them in FDA databases or scientific literature. She'd asked directly whether the treatment was approved, and the coordinator's response had been vague and defensive. Lieutenant Capul stated that based on this evidence, she believed they were looking at an unauthorized human medical experiment being conducted without proper oversight or safety protocols. The federal agent's involvement suggested there might be some government connection, or possibly a legitimate program that had gone rogue. But either way, people were being given experimental treatments that might be harmful and they weren't getting accurate information about the risks. Sarah's deteriorating condition documented in her logbook supported the conclusion that the treatment was causing significant harm. The question now was what to do with this information. If they went public or filed formal charges, the federal government would likely assert jurisdiction and classify the whole thing, potentially burying evidence and preventing accountability. But if they didn't act, there might be other people like Sarah participating in this program and being harmed. The lieutenant stated she was consulting with the Attorney General's office and with the State Health Department to determine the best approach. But in the meantime, they needed to keep investigating quietly and documenting everything they found. Over the following week, bits and pieces of information emerged that helped fill in the picture. The hospital in Hilo reported that Sarah's condition had stabilized once they'd flushed the unknown substance from her system, but she was experiencing significant neurological symptoms that the doctors were struggling to treat without knowing exactly what she'd been taking. Laboratory analysis of the vials from the shelter came back with disturbing results. The substance was a synthetic compound that didn't match any approved medication, and preliminary testing suggested it had both neurostimulant and neurotoxic properties that could explain Sarah's symptoms. Deputy Kaimanaka Haley had been checking in regularly with ER nurse Leilani Kalama to get updates on Sarah's condition. Leilani reported that Sarah had periods of lucidity where she could communicate, but also periods of confusion and memory loss that were getting worse rather than better. During one lucid period, Sarah had told Leilani that there were at least 6 other people she knew of who were participating in the same treatment program. All of them patients with serious medical conditions who'd been recruited through online forums and support groups for people with rare diseases. Sarah didn't know most of their real names, just screen names and general locations, but she was worried about them and wanted law enforcement to try to find them and warn them. The federal agents who'd shown up at the shelter location had disappeared after the first day, and attempts to contact them through the phone number they'd provided went unanswered. The identification they'd shown Lieutenant Kapuli had been real, according to federal law enforcement databases, but when the department tried to reach out to the agency those agents supposedly worked for, they were told no such investigation was active and no agents had been dispatched to Hawaii. That suggested either the agents were operating without official authorization, or more likely, that their agency was denying involvement to avoid accountability. Lieutenant Kapuli convened another meeting with Kaimana and Park Ranger Mahina Mahelona to discuss where the investigation stood. She stated that the Attorney General's office was building a case for unauthorized medical experimentation and fraud, but they were facing significant obstacles, including federal government stonewalling and the difficulty of identifying other victims who might have been harmed. The shelter site had been documented and dismantled, but they hadn't found any direct evidence of who had set it up or who was funding and organizing the program. The financial trail had dead-ended at shell companies and offshore accounts that would take months or years to untangle. What troubled the lieutenant most was the possibility that this wasn't an isolated incident. If someone had set up one unauthorized treatment site in rural Hawaii, they might have established others in different locations where oversight was limited, and desperate patients could be recruited to participate in dangerous experiments. The fact that Sarah had found the program through online forums suggested there was a sophisticated recruiting operation happening, targeting vulnerable people who were willing to take risks because conventional medicine had failed them. The investigation was going to continue, but it had effectively hit a wall. Without cooperation from the federal agents or the program organizers, and without being able to identify and interview other participants, they were left with one victim, one illegal facility, and a lot of unanswered questions about who was responsible and why. The Attorney General's office was considering various legal strategies, including filing civil charges that might force information disclosure through discovery processes, but that would take time and might ultimately be blocked by federal courts claiming jurisdiction. 3 weeks after finding the shelter, Deputy Kaimanaka Haley drove back to the location where Sarah's rental car had been discovered. The vehicle had long since been towed and returned to the rental company, and the shoulder of the road looked like any other empty stretch of highway. But Kaimana knew that just a quarter-mile down that rocky slope, there had been a secret medical facility where someone had been conducting unauthorized experiments on desperate people. The facility was gone now, dismantled and documented, but the people responsible had vanished like smoke. He stood there in the fading light, looking out over the volcanic landscape and thinking about all the questions that would probably never be answered. Who had organized the program? How many people had participated? How many had been harmed? Where were the organizers now, and were they setting up new facilities in new locations to continue their work? The case remained open, but Kaimana had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when an investigation was going to fade into the background. Filed away as unsolved and periodically reviewed but never truly resolved. Sarah had survived, but her neurological symptoms were likely permanent according to the specialists who'd examined her. She'd returned to the mainland to be closer to family, but she'd left behind a statement describing her experience and expressing hope that law enforcement would find and stop whoever had recruited her into the program. That statement was part of the case file, along with all the photographs and evidence and documentation they'd collected. It sat in a folder somewhere in the department's system, waiting for the break that might never come. As Kaimana drove away from the location, heading back toward the station to finish his shift, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd uncovered something significant but had failed to fully expose it. The people running that program were still out there, still recruiting victims, still conducting their experiments in secret locations where desperate people could be convinced to try treatments that might kill them. And unless something changed, unless some new evidence emerged or some participant came forward with information that could crack the case open, those people would continue operating with impunity. The saddle road stretched ahead through the gathering darkness, its curves disappearing into shadows that might hold answers, or might hold nothing at all. Some cases ended with justice. Others ended with knowledge that crimes had been committed but no way to hold anyone accountable. This one felt like the latter, and that weight would stay with Kaimana long after the official reports were filed, and the investigation was marked as inactive pending new leads. The volcanic fog was rolling in again as he reached the station, reducing the world to a gray uncertainty that seemed appropriate for a case defined by questions without answers.